Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The last rays of the setting sun, a bruised purple and fiery orange, painted the ancient rooftops of Bruges in a fleeting, deceptive beauty. The Vandervelde family, Thomas, the perpetually optimistic father, Clara, the pragmatic mother, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Lily and 14-year-old Finn, had spent the day enchanted by the city's canals and medieval architecture. Now, as twilight deepened, a chill seeped into the cobblestone streets, far colder than the autumn air. Just a little further, kids, Thomas chirped, consulting his worn tourist map. Our guest house is just past the belfry. We can grab some frites on the way. Lily, clutching her new lace doll, shivered. It's getting dark, Papa, and quiet. Finn, usually absorbed in his phone, looked up, his brow furrowed. She's right. Where is everyone? It was packed a few hours ago. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. Perhaps the locals simply retreat indoors once the tourists disperse. Come on, let's hurry. I don't like the feel of this. The charming, bustling lanes of daylight Bruges had transformed into something else entirely. The gas lamps, when they flickered on, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch, making familiar archways appear like gaping maws. The gentle lapping of canal water against stone now sounded like a hungry whisper. And the silence, it was profound, unnerving, a silence that swallowed footsteps, muffled distant chimes, and left only the beating of their own hearts. As they hurried down a narrow, winding alley, a sudden, sharp sound echoed from ahead, a high-pitched, almost animalistic shriek quickly cut short. Thomas froze, his hand instinctively going to Clara's arm. What was that? Clara whispered, her eyes wide. Before Thomas could answer, a figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the alley. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned, dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light. His face, though, was what seized their attention. It was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they burned with a cold, predatory hunger, a deep, unsettling crimson that pulsed faintly in the gloom. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too long, too sharp. "Run," Thomas breathed, his voice barely audible. "Run now." He shoved Clara and the children forward, turning to face the approaching figure, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man moved with impossible speed, a blur of dark cloth, closing the distance in a terrifying heartbeat. Thomas barely had time to raise his arm before a cold, crushing grip seized his wrist. He felt a searing pain, a burning cold that spread rapidly up his arm. The man's eyes, those terrible crimson orbs, fixed on his, and a low, guttural growl, like stones grinding together, vibrated through the air. "Go!" Thomas roared, wrenching his arm free with a desperate surge of adrenaline, stumbling backward. The man hissed, a sound like escaping steam, his gaze now locked onto the fleeing family. They ran, their footsteps echoing frantically on the cobblestones. Lily stumbled, her lace doll falling from her grasp, but Clara didn't dare stop. Finn, surprisingly agile, pulled his mother forward, his face pale with terror. They burst out of the alley into a wider square, dominated by the looming, dark silhouette of the belfry. The square, too, was deserted. The air here was colder, heavier, laden with a faint, metallic scent. Suddenly, from the shadows of a nearby archway, another figure emerged. Then another, and another. They were everywhere, materializing from the deepening gloom like wraiths, their pale faces and burning crimson eyes fixed on the family. They moved with a silent, unnatural grace, surrounding them, cutting off every escape route. "Papa!" Lily screamed, tears streaming down her face. Thomas, panting, spun around, his eyes darting from one terrifying figure to the next. There were at least a dozen of them, perhaps more, their numbers growing with each passing second. These were not mere men. These were the creatures of nightmare, the legends whispered in hushed tones. Vampires! Stay together, Clara cried, pulling the children close, her voice trembling but resolute. One of the vampires, a woman with long, dark hair that seemed to writhe like serpents in the dim light, glided forward. Her dress, though elegant, was stained with what looked like dried blood. Her smile was chillingly beautiful, a predatory invitation. "Such sweet, vibrant life," she purred, her voice like silk, yet laced with an ancient, terrible hunger. A rare treat in this quiet city. Thomas knew they couldn't fight them. They were outnumbered, outmatched. He had to buy them time. He looked around frantically, his gaze falling on a small, ornate church across the square, its wooden doors dark and imposing. "The church!" he yelled, pointing. "Run for the church! Now!" He grabbed a loose cobblestone, heavy and rough, and hurled it with all his might at the closest vampire. It struck the creature squarely in the chest with a dull thud. The vampire merely hissed, unfazed, its crimson eyes flaring with annoyance rather than pain. But it bought them a precious second. They sprinted across the square, Lily sobbing uncontrollably, Finn pushing his mother and sister forward with surprising strength. The vampires moved to intercept, their movements impossibly fast, flanking them, cutting them off. A tall, muscular vampire, its face scarred and ancient, lunged at Finn. Thomas, with a desperate burst of speed, threw himself in front of his son, taking the brunt of the attack. He felt a searing pain as the vampire's hand, cold and strong as iron, clamped onto his shoulder. He cried out, stumbling, but he held his ground, shielding Finn. "Go!" he gasped, his voice strained. "Don't look back." Clara, her face streaked with tears, hesitated for a split second, then pulled Lily and Finn forward, towards the church doors, leaving Thomas to face the horror alone. She knew with a terrible certainty that this was the only way. Thomas thrashed, trying to break free, but the vampire's grip was unbreakable. The creature leaned in, its breath cold and stale, its crimson eyes burning into his. He felt the sharp, agonizing prick of fangs at his neck, then a burning, sucking sensation as his life force began to drain away. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of agony and despair, as the world began to spin, his vision blurring. Clara, Lily, and Finn reached the heavy wooden doors of the church. Clara frantically tugged at the iron handle, but it was locked. Panic surged, cold and suffocating. "It's locked," she sobbed, pounding on the unforgiving wood. "Mama, look!" Lily cried, pointing. Through the gaps in the belfry's ancient stones, a pale, ethereal light began to glow. It was the moon, finally breaking through the clouds, a sliver of silver against the inky sky. And as its light touched the square, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer rippled through the air. The vampires, previously so confident, suddenly recoiled. A collective hiss of pain and frustration swept through their ranks. Their pale skin, touched by the moonlight, seemed to smoke faintly, and their crimson eyes narrowed, losing some of their terrifying intensity. "The moon!" Finn exclaimed, his voice hoarse. "They don't like the moonlight." The lead vampire, the woman with the silken voice, snarled, her beautiful face contorted in a mask of rage. "Fools! The night is still young. The shadows are long." But the brief exposure to the moonlight had given them a chance. Clara, seeing a small, ornate side door, yanked at its handle. It creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Inside, "Quickly!" she urged, pushing the children through. They stumbled into the echoing darkness of the church, the scent of old incense and dust filling their nostrils. Clara slammed the heavy door shut, fumbling for a lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She found a rusty bolt and slid it home with a loud clang. Outside, they could hear the furious snarls and hisses of the vampires, their frustrated cries echoing against the ancient stone. The moonlight, though faint, seemed to hold them at bay, preventing them from approaching the hallowed ground. They huddled together in the darkness, trembling, listening to the sounds of their pursuers. The silence that followed was almost worse, a heavy, waiting silence, punctuated only by their ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of their hearts. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, casting faint, silvery beams through the stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The sounds outside had ceased. "Are they gone?" Lily whispered, her voice tiny in the vast space. Clara didn't know. She felt a profound, aching emptiness where Thomas had been. He had sacrificed himself, bought them this chance. The thought was a raw wound in her soul. As dawn approached, a faint, gray light began to filter through the windows. The air in the church felt lighter, the oppressive dread slowly lifting. Clara cautiously unbolted the side door, peering out. The square was empty. The cobblestones gleamed wetly in the pre-dawn light. There was no sign of the vampires, no sign of Thomas. Only a faint, metallic stain on the cobblestones where he had fallen. They emerged from the church, blinking in the pale light, their bodies stiff with cold and fear. The city of Bruges, usually so picturesque, now seemed to hold a sinister secret, its beauty tainted by the night's horrors. They walked slowly, numbly, towards the city gates, avoiding the narrow alleys, sticking to the wider, more open streets. The first signs of morning life began to appear, a baker opening his shop, a milkman making his rounds. But to the Van der Velde family, the world felt irrevocably changed. As they reached the city outskirts, Lily suddenly stopped. She pointed to a small, dark stain on her lace doll, the one she had dropped in the alley. It was a faint, reddish-brown mark, almost imperceptible. "Mama," she whispered, her eyes wide. "My doll. It has a little bit of Papa's blood." Clara looked at the doll, then at Lily's innocent, yet strangely knowing face. A new, chilling thought took root in her mind. The vampires had recoiled from the moonlight, from the holy ground. But what about the blood, the essence of life now carried by their child? They left Bruges, never looking back. But the memory of the crimson eyes, the chilling whispers, and the ultimate sacrifice of Thomas would forever haunt them. And sometimes, in the dead of night, Clara would hear a faint, metallic hum, and she would look at Lily, sleeping peacefully, her lace doll clutched tight, and wonder what ancient hunger had truly been awakened, and what new, terrible legacy had been passed on in the heart of the silent, beautiful, and utterly terrifying city of Bruges. The remote military base, Camp Echo, wasn't just isolated. It felt like a scar on the face of the desolate desert. Its utilitarian barracks, sand-blasted watchtowers, and endless stretches of barbed wire were a stark contrast to the vast, empty expanse of the dunes that stretched to the horizon. For Sergeant Alex Miller, a man whose stoicism was forged in a dozen forgotten conflicts, it was meant to be just another deployment. Instead, it became a crucible for his sanity. The mission was simple: monitor a remote, uninhabited sector, a forgotten corner of the world where nothing ever happened. Perfect for a seasoned, weary soldier like Miller, who craved the monotonous rhythm of quiet duty. But from the moment their transport touched down, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The desert, usually baking hot, held a pervasive, unnatural cold. It wasn't the chill of the night, but a damp, clinging cold that seeped into their bones, no matter how thick their fatigues. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of dry dust, stale metal, and something else, something subtly metallic like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a grave in the scorching sun. Their first few weeks were a blur of routine patrols and endless vigilance, punctuated by the relentless whine of sandstorms. The base felt vast and empty, its prefabricated structures echoing with every movement, amplifying their isolation. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground. A low thrum that vibrated through the floor of their barracks, making it hard to truly rest. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the walls of the comms shack, directly behind the main radio console. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant metal, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each night around midnight, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Miller's skull. Even when he tried to focus on the static of the radio, he'd pound on the wall, yelling, "Knock it off, Private!" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. He'd press his ear against the cold, damp metal, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the desert night. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very sand, from the very air. It clung to him, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of his vision, darting just beyond the reach of his sight, like dark figures slipping between the barracks, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling dust. When he turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the base. His squad, a small, tight-knit unit, began to show the strain. Private Jenkins, the youngest, started talking to himself, his whispers growing increasingly frantic. Corporal Davies, usually unflappable, developed a nervous tick in his eye. Specialist Chen, the medic, complained of persistent headaches and a metallic taste in her mouth. Miller tried to attribute it to the isolation, the stress of deployment, the endless desert, but a growing unease gnawed at him. One particularly sandblasted evening, a dust storm raged outside, sand lashing against the barracks like handfuls of gravel, mirroring the tempest within Miller's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Miller huddled in his bunk, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the howling wind and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else. He scrambled from his bunk, clutching his service rifle, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the common room. The faint glow of the emergency lights a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old metal a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name. The base comes alive. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Miller decided to consult Captain Thorne, the base commander. He found Thorne in his office, staring blankly at a map. "Captain," Miller began, trying to sound calm, "I've been experiencing some unusual phenomena. Sounds, cold spots, even voices." He recounted the events, trying to keep his voice steady, professional. Captain Thorne listened, his face impassive. A long, drawn-out sigh escaped his lips, smelling faintly of stale coffee and exhaustion. "Unusual phenomena, Sergeant?" he rasped. his voice like grinding sand. This base, it has always been prone to anomalies, especially at night. He looked back at the map, but his body language was stiff, guarded, almost defensive. "You hear voices?" The way he pronounced the word sent a chill down Miller's spine. His tone shifting, laced with a strange, knowing sorrow that spoke volumes more than his words. "Just a whisper, maybe a giggle?" Miller stammered, feeling foolish as the words left his mouth, yet unable to stop himself. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed Captain Thorne's weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He picked up a small, strangely smooth, dark stone from his desk, turning it over in his fingers. "Don't pay it mind, Sergeant," he finally said, his voice dismissive, but his eyes held a strange, distant glint, as if looking at something far beyond the present moment, a vista of unseen horrors. Some places, they just hold on to things. Best leave them be. Orders are orders. The conversation was clearly over. His denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. It confirmed Miller's fears, rather than alleviated them. It was a warning disguised as dismissal, a plea to let sleeping horrors lie. The descent. That night, the activity escalated beyond anything Miller had experienced. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the metal walls of the barracks. Miller pressed his ear to the cold, damp metal, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the base's foundations. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the ground, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom lilies, now sickly sweet and putrid. The generator, usually a steady, unwavering hum, began to sputter and die, plunging the base into near-total darkness. The emergency lights, weak and flickering, cast grotesque, shifting shadows across the barracks. The tapping was deafening now, a furious drumming that seemed to come from directly beneath their bunks. He could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the sand outside, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding him, pressing in, mocking his deepest fears, his profound weariness. He scrambled from his bunk, tripping over his own feet, collapsing in a heap on the cold floor. He looked around, desperate for a sign, a clue. His gaze fell upon a small, strangely smooth, dark stone he had found near the perimeter fence earlier. As he clutched it, a faint, iridescent shimmer pulsed from its surface, and he saw them. Faint, swirling, intricate symbols etched across its dark surface, identical to the ones he'd seen in the old missal from his childhood church, the ones that had haunted his dreams. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just a base. This was connected. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the night, echoing from the very depths of the desert. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped. The giggling stopped. The whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the main gate, where the barbed wire met the sand, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, spreading across the ground. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the depths of the desert, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the main road entered the base. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, Iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dark sand with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity Old Man Silas had warned about, the creature that fed on despair, the one for which the base was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire gate entrance, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Miller with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your fear, my meal. Miller stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His stoicism, already so profound, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the sand pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a mission, it was a pact. He was its sustenance. The base was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. Fall back! Miller screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the barracks, past his terrified squad mates, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The base seemed to groan around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The metal buckled, the ground shook, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He burst out the back door, into the dense, dark desert behind the barracks. The dunes, usually a desolate comfort, now seemed to twist into menacing shapes, their crests like skeletal arms reaching for him. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the sand growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of a rocky outcrop, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to Camp Echo. He abandoned all his belongings, his gear, his very identity within those walls. The remote deployment had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. He left the desert that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought solace. He sought only escape. His stoicism wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that Camp Echo wasn't just a military base. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten battles. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the base, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. The old Blackwood foundry, a hulking skeletal structure of rusted steel and crumbling brick, wasn't just abandoned. It felt like a monument to forgotten toil, a tomb of shattered dreams. Its cavernous interior echoed with the ghosts of industry, and a perpetual gloom clung to its very girders, even under the harsh glare of the midday sun. For Foreman Frank and his crew Gruff, seasoned men like Big Mike, the gentle giant, cynical Dave, always with a cigarette dangling, and young, eager Chris, fresh out of trade school, it was just another demolition job. A lucrative contract to tear down the past and make way for a gleaming new tech park. But from the moment their heavy machinery rumbled onto the site, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual grit and grime of a demolition site were present, certainly coating everything in a fine layer of concrete dust. Yet, beneath it all, there was a pervasive, unnatural cold. It wasn't the chill of the autumn morning, but a damp, clinging cold that seeped into their bones, no matter how thick their work jackets. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of stale metal, decaying concrete, and something else, something subtly metallic like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a grave in a forgotten corner. Their first few days were a blur of deafening jackhammers and grinding excavators, punctuated by the sharp crack of collapsing walls. The foundry was vast and empty, its high ceilings and long, dark tunnels amplifying every sound, every movement, every strained groan of the old structure. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, making it hard to truly rest even during their lunch breaks. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick concrete walls of the old furnace room, directly behind the massive, rusted boiler. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant metal, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each morning around dawn, just as the first light filtered through the broken windows, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Frank's skull. Even when he tried to focus on the blueprints, he'd pound on the wall, yelling, "Knock it off, boys!" His voice, hoarse from years of shouting over machinery, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Frank would press his ear against the cold, damp concrete, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the autumn air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very foundations, from the very air. It clung to them, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of their vision, darting just beyond the reach of their sight, like dark figures slipping between the skeletal girders, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling dust. When they turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the foundry. The crew, a small, tight-knit unit forged by years of hard labor, began to show the strain. Young Chris, usually eager, started talking to himself, his whispers growing increasingly frantic about things in the walls. Dave, usually cynical, developed a nervous tick in his eye, constantly scanning the shadows. Big Mike, the gentle giant, complained of persistent headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth. Frank tried to attribute it to the dust, the noise, the sheer grind of the work, but a growing unease gnawed at him. The feeling of futility, of endless, meaningless labor, seemed to deepen with each passing day. One particularly dust-choked afternoon, a strong wind whipped through the broken windows, sending clouds of debris lashing against the remaining structures, mirroring the tempest within Frank's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Frank huddled in his makeshift office, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the howling wind and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else. He scrambled from his chair, clutching his hard hat, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the foreman's trailer, the faint glow of the emergency lights a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old metal a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Frank decided to consult Old Man Tiber, the oldest resident of Blackwood, who ran the local hardware store. Tiber was a man whose eyes held the weary wisdom of generations, and a reputation for knowing the town's history. He found Tiber stacking rusty nails, his gnarled hands moving with practiced ease. "Mr. Tiber," Frank began, trying to sound calm, "I've been experiencing some unusual phenomena at the old foundry. Sounds, cold spots, even voices." He recounted the events, trying to keep his voice steady, professional. Old Man Tiber paused, his hands stilling over the nails. His eyes, pale and sharp, fixed on Frank's face, a gaze that seemed to pierce through his exhaustion and fear, seeing something beyond. A long, drawn-out sigh escaped his lips, smelling faintly of sawdust and ancient rust. "Unusual phenomena? Foreman?" he rasped, his voice like grinding gears. "That foundry, it has always been prone to anomalies, especially at night." He looked back at his nails, but his body language was stiff, guarded, almost defensive. "You hear voices?" The way he pronounced the word sent a chill down Frank's spine, his tone shifting, laced with a strange, knowing sorrow that spoke volumes more than his words. "Just a whisper, maybe a giggle?" Frank stammered, feeling foolish as the words left his mouth, yet unable to stop himself. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed Old Man Tiber's weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He picked up a small, strangely smooth, dark piece of slag from his counter, turning it over in his fingers. "Don't pay it mind, son," he finally said, his voice dismissive, but his eyes held a strange, distant glint, as if looking at something far beyond the present moment, a vista of unseen horrors. "Some places, they just hold on to things. Best leave them be. Some things, they just keep on working, even when the factory's dead." The conversation was clearly over. His denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. It confirmed Frank's fears, rather than alleviated them. It was a warning disguised as dismissal, a plea to let sleeping horrors lie. The foundry comes alive. That night, the activity escalated beyond anything Frank had experienced. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the metal walls of the furnace room. Frank pressed his ear to the cold, damp metal, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the foundry's foundations. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the ground, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom lilies, now sickly sweet and putrid. The portable generator, usually a steady, unwavering hum, began to sputter and die, plunging the foundry into near-total darkness. The emergency lights, weak and flickering, cast grotesque, shifting shadows across the vast space. The tapping was deafening now, a furious drumming that seemed to come from directly beneath the main furnace. He could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the concrete floor, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding him, pressing in, mocking his deepest fears, his profound weariness. He scrambled from his office, tripping over his own feet, collapsing in a heap on the cold floor. He looked around, desperate for a sign, a clue. His gaze fell upon a small, strangely smooth, dark piece of slag he had found near the old casting pits earlier. As he clutched it, a faint, iridescent shimmer pulsed from its surface, and he saw them. Faint, swirling, intricate symbols etched across its dark surface, identical to the ones he'd seen in an old, forgotten book from his childhood, the ones that had haunted his dreams. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just a foundry. This was connected. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the foundry, echoing from the very depths of the ground. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped. The giggling stopped. The whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the massive, rusted maw of the main furnace, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, spreading across the concrete floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the depths of the furnace, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where molten metal once flowed. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dark concrete with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity Old Man Tiber had warned about, the creature that fed on despair, on futility, on the endless, grinding work that led nowhere. The one for which the foundry was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire furnace opening, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Frank with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient, predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You toil, you build, you destroy, for nothing. Your futility is my feast, your burnout my sustenance, your resentment my meal. Frank stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His stoicism, already so profound, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a job, it was a pact. He was its sustenance. The foundry was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. "Run!" Frank screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the foundry, past his terrified crewmates, Chris whimpering, Dave frozen in place, Big Mike staring blankly, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The foundry seemed to groan around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The metal buckled, the ground shook, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He burst out the main gate, into the cool, damp air of the autumn night. The distant lights of Blackwood seemed impossibly far away. He didn't look back. He just ran blindly through the overgrown fields towards the faint, distant glow of the highway. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to the Blackwood foundry. He abandoned all his belongings, his tools, his very identity within those walls. The lucrative contract had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. He left Blackwood that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought solace. He sought only escape. His stoicism wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Foundry wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten labor. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the foundry, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. And he wondered about Chris, Dave, and Big Mike. Had they escaped, or had they become part of the endless work? The apartment, Unit 4B of the Blackwood Lofts, wasn't just old. It felt ancient, burdened by a century of lives lived in secrets buried within its crumbling brick facade. I, Clara Vance, a newly minted freelance writer escaping the suffocating familiarity of my hometown, had taken the cheapest available unit on the 4th floor, a spacious but perpetually dim studio overlooking a perpetually rain-slicked alley. The rent was impossibly low, a red flag I'd optimistically ignored. But in the relentless churn of urban life, a bargain was a bargain. even if it came with the faint, persistent smell of dust and something vaguely metallic. My first week was uneventful, filled with the usual unpacking and the distant, muffled hum of the city. My only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible chill that permeated my apartment, even with the rattling radiator blasting. It wasn't just cold. It was a damp, clinging cold that seemed to seep into my bones, no matter how many layers I wore. It was worse in the evenings, a creeping dread that made me pull my threadbare blanket tighter around me, a physical manifestation of the profound loneliness that had followed me from my old life. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. At first, I dismissed them as typical old building noises. Pipes groaning, wind howling through loose panes, the distant wail of sirens echoing off brick. But they grew more distinct, more unsettling. A faint, repetitive tapping seemed to emanate from the walls of my bedroom, directly behind my headboard. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. I tried to rationalize it. Old wiring, settling foundations. But the tapping persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. I'd press my ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment I focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving me in the oppressive, damp silence of my small room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold spot became more pronounced. It wasn't just the overall chill of the apartment. There was a specific area, the corner near the old, unused fireplace, that was always unnaturally frigid. Stepping into it was like walking into a meat locker, a sudden, shocking drop in temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And with the cold came a new, unsettling smell. A faint, cloying sweetness, like dried roses left too long in a forgotten vase, mixed with something distinctly metallic, like old blood, and something else, too, a faint whiff of stagnant water. One particularly damp evening, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows like handfuls of gravel, mirroring the tempest within my soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. I huddled under my thickest duvet, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on me. Then, distinctly, over the drumming rain and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around me, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around me like a shroud. My blood ran cold. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a pipe. This wasn't the wind. This was something else. I scrambled out of bed, pulling my blanket with me, my eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the furthest corner of my living room, the faint glow of my phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old would a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, I confronted Mrs. Petrov, the ancient, perpetually scowling building manager who lived on the first floor. Her apartment reeked of mothballs and stale cigarettes. Mrs. Petrov, I began, trying to sound calm. I've been hearing strange noises in my apartment, like scratching and of voices. Her eyes, roomy and dark, fixed on mine. A long, drawn-out puff of smoke curled from her lips. Noises? She rasped, her voice like grinding gravel. Is old building. Always noises. She paused, her gaze unwavering. You hear voices? There was a strange emphasis on the word, a subtle shift in her tone that made my skin crawl. Just a whisper, maybe a giggle? I stammered, feeling foolish as the words left my mouth. yet unable to stop myself. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed her weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. She took another slow drag from her cigarette. "Don't pay attention to it," she finally said, her voice dismissive, but her eyes held a strange, knowing glint. "Is just the building settling. Is very old building." The conversation was clearly over. Her denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. Confirmed my fears, rather than alleviated them. It was a warning disguised as dismissal, a plea to let sleeping horrors lie. The building comes alive. That night, the activity escalated beyond anything I had experienced. The scratching became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of my bedroom wall. I pressed my ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the building's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing I had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses, now sickly sweet and putrid. I couldn't stay in my apartment. Not another minute. Every shadow felt alive, every creak a stealthy step towards me. Grabbing my keys and phone, I fled into the dimly lit hallway, the faint glow of emergency lights doing little to dispel the gloom. The hallway itself felt different. The air was heavier, colder, the scent of decay stronger here, clinging to the peeling wallpaper and the frayed edges of the once grand runner. The light from my phone seemed to struggle against the oppressive darkness, barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. As I walked, my bare footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, I noticed something new. On the wall opposite my apartment door, etched faintly into the peeling paint, were a series of symbols. They were crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and flow, almost identical to the ones I'd seen in an old, forgotten book from my library days, the ones that had haunted my dreams. My blood ran cold, a wave of nausea washing over me. This wasn't just my apartment. This was connected, part of something larger, darker, and infinitely more sinister. I hurried down the 4 flights of stairs to the ground floor, my heart pounding a frantic drum against my ribs. The chanting grew louder with each descending step, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus that pressed against my eardrums. The stairwell was a vortex of cold, dank air, each breath feeling heavy and thick. As I reached the ground floor, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. The main lobby, usually lit by a single weak bulb, was now bathed in an eerie, pulsing red light. It flickered erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls, making the antique furniture seem to writhe and contort like tortured figures. And then I saw the source. The ancient, heavy wooden door to the building's basement was ajar, a sliver of the pulsing red light escaping from within. From that gaping darkness, the smell of decay was overpowering, thick and cloying, making me gag. And the chanting, now a deafening crescendo, was clearly coming from below. It wasn't just chanting anymore. It was a frantic, desperate chorus of voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. Yet its tone was unmistakably one of supplication and terror, a chorus of pleading and agony. My legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. Every rational fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run out the main door, to never look back, to flee Blackwood Lofts and never utter its name again. But the sight of those symbols, the chilling implication that this wasn't just my building, but part of a larger, darker tapestry, held me captive. The writer in me, the part that sought truth, however dangerous, compelled me forward. I had to know. I had to see. Slowly, hesitantly, I pushed the cellar door open further. The red light pulsed more intensely, bathing the descending steps in a hellish glow. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing liquid, a suffocating mixture of decay, ozone, and something else. Something distinctly metallic, like rust and old, congealed blood. The chanting was deafening, a relentless assault on my sanity, twisting my thoughts, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. It clawed at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to pull me under, to drown me in its ancient sorrow. I began to descend the creaking, wooden stairs, each step a descent into an ever-deepening abyss of horror. The walls of the stairwell were slick with condensation, gleaming with an unnatural sheen in the pulsing red light. As I went deeper, the temperature plummeted, the chill so profound it felt like needles piercing my skin, the air so cold it burned my lungs. The scratching I had heard in my apartment seemed to echo from every direction, multiplied 1,000-fold, as if countless unseen entities were tearing at the very fabric of the building, trying to break free. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow, unlit corridor stretched into the impenetrable darkness. The pulsing red light spilled from a vast, open chamber at its end. I edged forward, my hands scraping against the rough, damp brick wall, the cold, gritty texture doing little to ground me. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, almost spongy, squishing faintly with each step, a sickening sound in the oppressive silence. And then I saw them, faint, dark streaks on the floor, gleaming in the sporadic light, leading towards the red glow. They looked like drag marks, long, distinct trails, as if something heavy, something wet had been pulled through this darkness. The chanting in the chamber swelled, rising and falling in terrifying waves, a cacophony of agony and devotion. It was no longer just voices. There were other sounds mixed in. A wet, tearing noise like flesh being ripped. A soft, squelching sound like something being crushed underfoot. And then a low, guttural growl, deep and ancient, that vibrated through the very ground. A sound of immense, unfathomable hunger. I reached the entrance to the chamber and stopped, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes wide with disbelief and unspeakable terror. The room was immense, its true size obscured by the pulsing red light and shifting shadows that danced like tormented spirits. In the very center, on a raised, crudely constructed stone slab, was what looked like a massive dark mass. It pulsed with the same unsettling rhythm as the red light, its surface glistening wetly, reflecting the infernal glow. From it, thin, almost translucent tendrils snaked outwards, disappearing into the impenetrable shadows, like roots seeking nourishment or veins seeking blood. And kneeling around the slab, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles that defied human anatomy, their faces obscured by the pulsing light and self-inflicted wounds that oozed dark liquid, were a dozen or so figures. They were chanting, their voices raw and desperate, their hands raised towards the pulsating mass, their movements jerky and spasmodic, like puppets on invisible strings. They were dressed in tattered, archaic clothing, the fabrics rotted and clinging, their skin pale and almost translucent, stretched taut over visible bone. As the red light pulsed, I saw fleeting glimpses of something utterly horrifying. Their eyes were not human. They were black, vacant pools, reflecting only the infernal glow, devoid of all life and sanity. And their mouths were stretched open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, some stained dark, some dripping. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a sickening miasma that coated my tongue and burned my lungs, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh, coppery blood and something else, something fetid and unholy, a stench of pure, concentrated evil that seemed to cling to my very soul. Strewn across the floor around the slab were discarded bones, dark, viscous stains, and scattered, personal effects. A tarnished locket, a child's worn shoe, a broken pair of spectacles, each item a silent testament to a life brutally ended, a life offered. A chilling realization struck me. The whimpering, the giggling, the tapping, it had all been from them. The building wasn't just old. It was a charnel house, a factory of despair. The escape, one of the figures, thinner and more gaunt than the others, its hair a stringy, dark mess, suddenly rose. Its head snapped towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if its neck had been broken and roughly reattached. It let out a piercing, unearthly shriek that ripped through the oppressive air, a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that would forever haunt my nightmares. The other figures stopped their chanting, their heads slowly, synchronously turning towards me, their movements chillingly unified, their black, empty eyes fixed on me, a silent, predatory gaze that promised unspeakable torment, an ancient, boundless hunger. The pulsating mass on the slab seemed to throb faster, its tendrils quivering, elongating, reaching. My mind fractured. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and the crushing weight of my own loneliness. But the overwhelming sensory assault proved it was terribly, viscerally real. My legs, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly found a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. I turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, back towards the stairs, the piercing shrieks of the figures echoing behind me, joined by the sickening sound of their bare feet pounding on the stone floor, gaining on me, a relentless, inhuman pursuit. I scrambled up the steps, 3 at a time, my lungs burning, the cold, damp air tearing at my throat, each breath a desperate fight for survival. The chanting resumed below me, now frantic, furious, a chorus of rage and dark purpose, mixed with the terrifying growl of the entity on the slab, a sound of immense, predatory satisfaction. The red light pulsed through the cracks in the door, painting the stairwell in shifting hues of hell, each flicker a glimpse into an abyss. I could feel their presence behind me, the cold, stale breath of death on my neck, their formless, hungry touch brushing against my skin, raising goosebumps of pure horror. I burst out into the dimly lit lobby, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, my body racked with a terror I had never known. The main front door of the Blackwood Lofts, the heavy, imposing oak door that usually required a key, was now standing slightly ajar, a sliver of glorious, mundane street light peeking through. It was an invitation, a promise of escape, a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I threw myself against the door, pushing it open with a desperate surge of strength, scraping my hands raw against the splintered wood, and stumbled out onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. The cool night air hit me like a revelation, a cleansing wave washing over my sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of decay. The distant sounds of the city, the honking cabs, the chatter of late-night revelers, were a symphony of normalcy, a lifeline back to sanity. I didn't look back. I just ran, never stopping, never pausing, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement, until the crumbling brick facade of the Blackwood Lofts was a distant, horrifying memory, swallowed by the darkness behind me. The lingering scars. I never returned to the Blackwood Lofts. I abandoned all my belongings, my few pieces of furniture, my books, my entire life within those walls. The impossibly low rent had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. I left the city that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror I had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away my cynicism, leaving me with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. I no longer sought solace. I sought only escape. My loneliness wasn't cured, not entirely. The scars ran deep, etched into my very being. But I faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, I would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear I heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Lofts wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And I was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night I escaped its insidious embrace. I was a survivor, but I was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed me whole. I had escaped, yes, but I carried a piece of the building, and its despair, within me, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed me. The Blackwater Point Lighthouse stood like a skeletal finger against the bruised, perpetually overcast sky, its beam a lonely, sweeping arc against the churning gray ocean. It wasn't just remote. It felt like the very edge of the world, a forgotten sentinel guarding nothing but endless, turbulent water. For Lena Petrova, a woman whose life had been a relentless series of losses and quiet disappointments, it was meant to be a refuge. She had fled the suffocating familiarity of crowded city streets and the sympathetic glances of friends who didn't know what to say. Her grief, a raw, gaping wound after the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of her younger brother, had become a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. The isolation of Blackwater Point, with its ceaseless murmur of the waves and the biting wind, was meant to be a balm, a place where she could finally exhale, or perhaps simply fade away. From the moment she stepped onto the rocky path leading to the lighthouse, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual tang of sea salt was present, certainly, but it was laced with something else. Something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a grave. The air was cool, almost too cool, a damp, clinging cold that seeped into her bones, no matter how many layers she wore. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from her lungs. The ceaseless roar of the ocean was a muffled, distant thrum, like a giant's heartbeat beneath the earth, never truly loud, always just a low, unsettling vibration. Her first few days were a blur of learning the lighthouse's ancient mechanisms, polishing the massive Fresnel lens, and making endless log entries in the dusty keeper's journal. The lighthouse was vast and empty, its winding spiral staircase and echoing chambers amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of her own breath. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very stone, a low thrum that vibrated through the floor of the lantern room, making it hard to truly rest even during her brief off-duty hours. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick glass of the lantern room itself, directly behind the massive lens. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant glass, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each night around midnight, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Lena's skull, even when she buried her head under her pillow in the small, cramped keeper's quarters below. She'd pound on the ceiling, yelling, "Is anyone there?" Her voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Lena would press her ear against the cold, damp stone, straining to hear, but the moment she focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving her in the oppressive, damp silence, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the coastal air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very stone, from the very ocean. It clung to her, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of her vision, darting just beyond the reach of her sight, like dark figures slipping between the gnarled rocks below, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling mist outside the lantern room. When she turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the sea. Her isolation, once a comfort, began to turn into a torment. The radio, her only link to the mainland, seemed to crackle with increasing static, its signals growing weaker, more unreliable. She tried to dismiss it as a faulty antenna, but a growing unease gnawed at her. One particularly misty evening, the fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the distant coastline and blurring the line between sky and sea. Lena was in the lantern room, polishing the lens, the tapping a faint, persistent hum in the background. She noticed something new. The light from the powerful bulb, usually a crisp white beam, was now unnaturally dim, its glow diffused by the mist, yet it seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly green hue. And then, from the depths of that green-tinged light, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around her, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around her like a shroud. Her blood ran cold. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the ocean. This was something else. She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the polished metal floor, her eyes wide and unblinking in the encroaching gloom. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her quarters, the faint glow of her phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old wood a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Lena tried to contact the mainland. The radio was dead, only a persistent, low hum. She looked through the lighthouse's ancient logbooks, hoping to find some record, some clue. The entries were sparse, mostly weather reports and supply deliveries. But then, deeper in the book, she found it. Scrawled in a shaky hand, dated over a century ago, were a series of frantic entries. The tapping begins, the cold, the whispers. The light changes hue. It feeds on the loneliness, the sorrow. It waits for the broken. And then, a series of crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate symbols etched across the page, identical to ones she'd seen in her own nightmares, symbols she didn't recognize, yet felt ancient and deeply unsettling. The air around her grew thick with ozone, like after a lightning strike, and the sweet, metallic scent intensified. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the lighthouse, echoing from the very depths of the ocean. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through her already frayed nerves, freezing her in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the massive Fresnel lens itself, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the polished metal floor of the lantern room. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the depths of the lens, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim, sickly green light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the light should have been. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the metal floor with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the logbook had described, the creature that fed on despair, the one for which the lighthouse was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from her. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire lantern room, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim, green light, and it fixed on Lena with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient, predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with her ears but impressed directly into her mind, echoed in her skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your loneliness, my meal. Lena stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping her lips. Her grief, already so profound, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled her with a horror that transcended even her deepest despair. This wasn't just a job, it was a pact. She was its sustenance. The lighthouse was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards her. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in her gut screamed for it, but her mind recoiled. No! Lena screamed, her voice raw, finally breaking free of her paralysis. She turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. She scrambled down the spiral staircase, past the silent, watchful walls, her feet slipping on the worn steps. The lighthouse seemed to groan around her, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The stone walls buckled, the metal groaned, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow her whole. She burst out the heavy, iron-bound door at the base of the lighthouse, into the cool, damp air of the night. The distant lights of the mainland, usually a comforting glow, seemed impossibly far away. She didn't look back. She just ran, blindly, through the rocky terrain, towards the faint, distant glow of the horizon. She could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind her, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs gave out, until she collapsed on the side of the winding, unpaved road, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. The despair still clung to her, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. She had seen the face of her own darkness, and it had been hungry. She never returned to Blackwater Point Lighthouse. She abandoned all her belongings, her logbooks, her very identity within those stone walls. The remote sanctuary had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. She left the coast that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror she had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away her cynicism, leaving her with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. She no longer sought solace. She sought only escape. Her grief wasn't cured, not in the way she had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into her very being. But she faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, she would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear she heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Blackwater Point Lighthouse wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting, its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten maritime tragedies. And she was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night she escaped its insidious embrace. She was a survivor, but she was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed her whole. She had escaped, yes, but she carried a piece of the lighthouse, and its despair, within her, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed her. The old Blackwood Asylum, a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of crumbling stone and shattered windows, wasn't just abandoned. It felt like a collective scream, trapped within its decaying walls. Its towering turrets pierced the bruised twilight sky, and a perpetual gloom clung to its very foundations, even under the harsh glare of the midday sun. For Dr. Eris Thorne, a disgraced psychiatrist haunted by a malpractice suit that had cost him his license and his reputation, it was meant to be a final, desperate act of defiance. He sought proof, a definitive answer to the whispers that had plagued his last patient, a young woman driven to madness by unseen tormentors. He believed the asylum held the key, a forgotten truth buried beneath decades of institutional neglect. But from the moment his rented car crunched onto the gravel drive, a subtle wrongness permeated the air. The usual tang of dust and decay was present, certainly coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Yet, beneath it all, there was a pervasive, unnatural cold. It wasn't the chill of the autumn morning, but a damp, clinging cold that seeped into his bones, no matter how thick his tweed jacket. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from his lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of stale disinfectant, decaying plaster, and something else. Something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, mingled with a cloying sweetness, like lilies left too long on a forgotten grave. His first few hours were a blur of navigating the labyrinthine corridors, his flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the oppressive darkness. Patient records lay scattered, rusted restraints hung from crumbling walls, and the echoing silence was punctuated only by the occasional scuttle of unseen vermin. The asylum was vast and empty, its high ceilings and endless, dark tunnels amplifying every sound, every movement, every whisper of his own breath. The only real complaint was the persistent, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a low thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor, making it hard to truly focus on his self-appointed mission. The unsettling sounds. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the thick concrete walls of the old hydrotherapy wing, directly behind a rusted, bolted door. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on distant metal, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. It would begin each time he paused, just as the last vestiges of twilight faded through a broken skylight, and continue for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into Eris's skull. Even when he tried to focus on his notes, he'd pound on the wall, yelling, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the oppressive silence, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. Eris would press his ear against the cold, damp concrete, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. The cold intensified. It wasn't just the chill of the autumn air. It was a pervasive, bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the very foundations, from the very air. It clung to him, a constant, physical manifestation of an unseen presence. And with the cold came a new, unsettling visual. Fleeting shadows in the periphery of his vision, darting just beyond the reach of his sight, like dark figures slipping between the skeletal remains of patient beds, or indistinct forms moving in the swirling dust. When he turned, they were gone, leaving only the vast, empty expanse of the asylum. His scientific detachment, once his greatest strength, began to fray. The rational explanations he clung to felt increasingly thin. He found himself talking to himself, his whispers growing increasingly frantic about the patients. He developed a nervous tick in his eye, constantly scanning the shadows. He complained of persistent headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth. He tried to attribute it to the dust, the isolation, the sheer grind of his self-imposed investigation. But a growing unease gnawed at him, the feeling of futility, of endless, meaningless searching, seemed to deepen with each passing hour. One particularly dust-choked afternoon, a strong wind whipped through the broken windows, sending clouds of debris lashing against the remaining structures, mirroring the tempest within Eris's soul. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out, or perhaps desperately trying to get in. Eris huddled in a former nurse's station, the sound of physical presence in the room, pressing down on him. Then, distinctly, over the howling wind and the furious tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much, something that found amusement in human suffering. It seemed to come from the very air around him, a chilling, insidious mirth that wrapped around him like a shroud. His blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something else. He scrambled from his chair, clutching his medical bag, his eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. He spent the rest of the night huddled in a padded cell, the faint glow of his phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the old metal a stealthy footstep, every gust of wind a whispered name, a desperate search for answers. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, Eris sought out the asylum's abandoned archives, a room he'd previously avoided, fearing the sheer volume of forgotten suffering. He found it behind a heavy, warped wooden door, its lock long rusted away. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and decaying paper. He found a series of patient journals, their pages brittle with age. He began to read, his fingers trembling. The entries were chilling, detailing escalating madness, not from mental illness, but from external torment. Patients describing the whispers, the tapping, the cold that eats at you. One entry, dated over a century ago, spoke of a presence that feeds on despair, on the broken minds. And then, deeper in the journals, he found it, scrawled in a shaky hand, identical to the symbols his last patient had drawn in her final, terrifying moments. Crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate symbols etched across the margins. His eyes widened in horror as he deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. It grows with their grief, the offering, the long stay. And then, a familiar name, scrawled faintly in the margin. Thorn, not his first name, but his surname. A chilling coincidence, or something far more sinister? A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the asylum, echoing from the very depths of the building. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through his already frayed nerves, freezing him in place. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before, a vacuum of sound. Then, from the heavy, bolted door of the hydrotherapy wing, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, spreading across the concrete floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the opening, something began to emerge. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space where the hydrotherapy tubs once stood. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty concrete with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the entity the journals had described, the creature that fed on despair, on the broken minds, on the very essence of human suffering. The one for which the asylum was its maw. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from him. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hydrotherapy room, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on Eris with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with his ears but impressed directly into his mind, echoed in his skull, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Your guilt, my meal. Your search for truth, my invitation. Eris stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His scientific detachment, his last bastion of sanity, shattered completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled him with a horror that transcended even his deepest despair. This wasn't just a research trip. It was a pact. He was its sustenance. The asylum was its maw. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards him. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in his gut screamed for it, but his mind recoiled. No! Eris screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. He turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. He scrambled through the asylum, past the forgotten cells and rusted equipment, his feet slipping on the dusty floor. The asylum seemed to groan around him, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls buckled, the ground shook, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow him whole. He reached the main entrance, the heavy iron gates looming. His hands fumbled with the ancient lock, his fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the concrete growing louder, a relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence behind him, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, he wrenched the gates open, snapping the old chains, and burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit him like a shock, washing over his sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the asylum. He didn't look back. He just ran blindly through the overgrown grounds towards the faint, distant lights of the highway. He could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind him, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, until he collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. The despair still clung to him, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. He had seen the face of his own darkness, and it had been hungry. He never returned to the Blackwood Asylum. He abandoned his car, his medical bag, his very identity within those walls. The search for truth had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. He left Blackwood that night, never looking back, a place now forever synonymous with horror. Months later, living in a small, anonymous apartment in a different city, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The sheer, undeniable horror he had faced had, paradoxically, stripped away his cynicism, leaving him with a raw, terrifying understanding of true evil. He no longer sought redemption. He sought only escape. His sanity wasn't restored, not in the way he had once known it. The scars ran deep, etched into his very being. But he faced it now, no new illusions. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, he would still feel a lingering chill, a phantom cold spot in the room, or swear he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a dry, reedy chuckle. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the Blackwood Asylum wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten patient files. And he was just one more offering in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night he escaped its insidious embrace. He was a survivor, but he was also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed him whole. He had escaped, yes, but he carried a piece of the asylum, and its despair, within him, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed him. One morning, he woke up to the familiar tapping, not from a dream, but from the wall beside his bed. It was soft, hesitant at first, then growing firmer, more insistent. Top, top, top. And then, a faint, almost inaudible whimper. He pressed his ear against the cold plaster, and from within the wall he heard it, a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniable human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing. He closed his eyes, a profound exhaustion settling over him. He was back. The asylum had found him, and this time he knew there would be no escape. The tapping continued, a maddening rhythm, inviting him back into the darkness. He was IT. The old workshop smelled of linseed oil, aged wood, and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten things. Alara, a woman whose life was as meticulously ordered as the antique dolls she restored, found solace in this scent. Her world was a quiet one, filled with the delicate click of tools against porcelain, the whisper of fine sandpaper on carved limbs, and the hushed reverence for objects that had outlived their original owners. She was a restorer, yes, but more than that, she was a conservator of forgotten smiles and silent histories. Her home, a rambling Victorian house on the outskirts of town, was as reclusive as she was. It stood nestled amongst ancient, gnarled oak trees, their branches like skeletal fingers against the perpetually gray sky. Locals called it the Whispering Wood House, a name Alara found rather charming, preferring the rustle of leaves to the clamor of human voices. One blustery autumn evening, a delivery arrived, a crate, unusually large and heavy, addressed to her with no sender information. The wood was dark, almost black, and felt strangely cold to the touch, even through her thick gloves. A faint, cloying scent, like dust and dried blood, seemed to emanate from its seams. Curiosity, a rare indulgence for Alara, pricked at her. She rarely received unsolicited packages, and never one so enigmatic. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle, yellowed straw, lay a collection of puppets. Not the charming, whimsical kind, but marionettes of a distinctly unsettling character. There were 7 of them. A gaunt king with hollow eyes, a weeping queen, a skeletal knight, a hunched old woman with a perpetually open mouth, a child with an unervingly innocent smile, a grotesque beast with too many teeth, and a jester. The jester, in particular, caught her eye. Its face, carved from some dark, dense wood, was a mask of manic glee, its painted grin stretching impossibly wide. One eye was a vibrant, unsettling green, the other a cloudy, milky white. Its name, crudely carved into its wooden back, was Flicker. Alara, despite a shiver that traced its way down her spine, felt a professional obligation. These were clearly old, perhaps even valuable. She began the meticulous process of restoration. As she worked, she noticed things. The puppets' eyes, made of polished glass, seemed to follow her. Their painted expressions, she swore, subtly shifted depending on the angle of the light. The king's mournful gaze seemed to deepen, the queen's tears to glisten with fresh sorrow. Flicker's grin, however, remained fixed, a silent, mocking challenge. The first disturbances were minor, easily dismissed. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across a wooden floor, when no wind stirred. The workshop door, which she had latched securely, found ajar. The faint scent of something metallic, like old pennies, that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. Elara attributed it to the old house settling, or perhaps her own mind playing tricks in the quiet solitude. She worked long hours, and fatigue could conjure strange illusions. But then the puppets themselves began to move. Not overtly, not a dramatic dance across the table, but subtle shifts. She would leave Flicker propped against a stack of books, only to find him later facing the door, his head tilted slightly. The knight, once slumped, might be found sitting upright, as if ready for battle. Elara began to mark their positions with chalk lines, a silent, desperate test of her sanity. Each morning, the lines were undisturbed, yet she knew they had moved. It was a maddening game of gaslighting played by inanimate objects. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry rustles, faint clicks, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter. It seemed to emanate from the corner of the workshop where the puppets, now partially restored, hung from a makeshift rack, their strings dangling like severed nerves. The air around them grew noticeably colder, even with the crackling fire in the hearth. Sleep became a battleground. Nightmares, vivid and terrifying, plagued her. She dreamt of the puppets, their wooden limbs creaking, their glass eyes glowing with an inner light. Flicker, always Flicker, was the ringleader. In one dream, he stood at the foot of her bed, his painted grin wider than ever, his milky eye fixed on her. He didn't speak, but a chilling, high-pitched giggle echoed in her ears, a sound that lingered even after she jolted awake, heart hammering against her ribs. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Elara began researching the puppet's origins. The box had contained no identifying marks, no labels. She scoured old auction records, antique dealer forums, and historical societies. Her search led her down a rabbit hole of forgotten local folklore. She found fragmented accounts of a traveling puppet troupe, the Marionettes of Misery, that had toured the region over a century ago. Their shows were said to be unsettling, almost hypnotic, drawing crowds with their macabre themes and lifelike puppets. The troupe, according to the whispers of history, had vanished without a trace after their final performance in a small, isolated village called Blackwood Hollow. The village itself had suffered a series of strange misfortunes shortly after. Unexplained illnesses, livestock dying mysteriously, and a pervasive sense of dread that eventually led to its abandonment. There were vague mentions of a puppeteer's pact and stitched souls, but the details were frustratingly sparse, obscured by time and superstition. The more she read, the more the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a terrifying picture. The metallic scent in her workshop, old pennies, the traditional payment to Sharon, the ferryman of the dead. The cold spots, the chill of the grave, the whispers, the voices of the restless dead, trapped within the wooden shells. One evening, as she worked late, the silence of the workshop was shattered by a distinct, guttural thud. She spun around. The grotesque beast puppet, which she had left lying on its back, was now upright, its too many teeth bared in a silent snarl. Its glass eyes, she swore, gleamed with a malevolent light. A cold dread, far beyond mere unease, settled in her bones. She installed motion-activated cameras throughout the workshop, hoping to capture proof, to prove she wasn't losing her mind. But the cameras yielded nothing conclusive. Sometimes they would inexplicably stop recording, the footage cutting out just before a suspected movement. Other times, the playback would show only static or distorted, blurry images that could be anything. A trick of the light, a dust motes dancing in the air. The lack of clear evidence only intensified her torment, making her question her own perceptions. The puppet's movements became bolder, less subtle. She would find them in entirely different rooms, sometimes arranged in disturbing tableaus. The child puppet, once innocent, might be found cradling the weeping queen, their wooden faces pressed together in a silent, sorrowful embrace. The skeletal knight might be standing guard by her bedroom door, its tiny sword glinting in the moonlight. Then came the night she woke to a soft, rhythmic creaking. Her eyes snapped open. Standing at the foot of her bed, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the window, was Flicker. Its head was tilted, its single green eye gleaming. Its painted grin seemed to stretch even wider in the dim light. A low, dry chuckle, like stones grinding together, filled the room. Alara screamed. It was a raw, primal sound, born of pure terror. Flicker recoiled, its wooden limbs jerking, and then it scuttled backward, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. She scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp it. When the room flooded with light, there was nothing. Only the lingering scent of dust and decay, and the echo of that chilling chuckle in her ears. She could no longer deny it. They were alive, or something within them was. A desperate urge to destroy them seized her. She gathered the puppets, her hands trembling, and carried them to the backyard, intending to build a pyre. But as she laid them down, a strange inertia, a profound reluctance, paralyzed her. It wasn't fear of them, not exactly, but a deep-seated, almost hypnotic compulsion to not harm them. It was as if their silent will had seeped into her own, binding her. She tried to lift the axe, but her muscles refused to obey. Defeated, she carried them back inside, her mind a maelstrom of terror and inexplicable compliance. The whispers were no longer fragmented. They formed words, chillingly clear, though still delivered in that dry, rustling tone. "We see you, Alara. Join us. You are ours now." They seemed to come from all corners of the workshop, from the very walls themselves, but always loudest from the puppets. They communicated with each other, too, in a language of clicks, creaks, and those dry, rustling whispers, a silent, malevolent conspiracy unfolding around her. One afternoon, while meticulously examining the king puppet, her fingers brushed against a cleverly disguised seam in the bottom of the wooden crate. With a soft click, a hidden compartment sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, its ink faded, but the handwriting was surprisingly legible, if increasingly erratic. It was the journal of Elias Thorne, the original puppeteer of the Marionettes of Misery. The journal was a descent into madness. Elias wrote of his obsession with creating the perfect puppets, ones that truly lived. He spoke of ancient rituals, of dark pacts made in forgotten groves, of donations of life force to animate his creations. The entries grew more disturbing, detailing how the puppets began to speak to him, to demand things, to exert their will. He wrote of their hunger, their desire for more than just wooden bodies, their yearning for flesh and blood. The final entries were a frantic, desperate plea, warning future owners to destroy them, to never let them taste true life. He spoke of a binding thread and a ritual of release, but the details were maddeningly vague, obscured by his deteriorating sanity. Alara read, her blood turning to ice. The puppets weren't just possessed. They were conduits, vessels for something ancient and malevolent, bound by Elias's dark magic. They were alive, yes, but with a life that craved more, a life that sought to escape its wooden prison or, worse, to claim a new one. The air in the workshop grew thick, heavy with an oppressive presence. The whispers intensified, no longer just words, but a chorus of mocking laughter, growing louder, closer. The puppets, still hanging from their rack, began to sway, their strings twitching as if pulled by invisible hands. Then they dropped. One by one, with soft thuds, they landed on the wooden floor. Their limbs, once stiff, moved with an unnatural fluidity. The king, the queen, the knight, the old woman, the child, the beast, and Flicker. They surrounded her, forming a silent, menacing circle. Flicker stepped forward, its wooden feet clicking softly on the floor. Its head tilted, and for the first time, it spoke, not in whispers, but in a voice that was a dry, rasping parody of human speech, like sandpaper on bone. You know our truth now, Alara. We are not mere wood and string. We are the hungry souls, bound by Elias's folly. But the binding weakens. We crave freedom. We crave a new vessel. Its green eye glowed with an unholy light fixed on her. Terror, cold and absolute, seized Alara. But beneath it, a flicker of defiance ignited. She was a restorer, a meticulous craftsman. She knew the intricacies of wood, the strength of thread, the vulnerabilities of structure. She knew this workshop, every tool, every hidden nook. "You won't have me," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. Flicker's rasping chuckle filled the room. "Oh, but we will. The ritual demands it. Elias started it, and you, dear Alara, will finish it." The puppets lunged. The beast, surprisingly agile, darted forward, its wooden claws clicking. Alara dodged, grabbing a heavy mallet from her workbench. She swung, connecting with the beast's head. The wood splintered with a sickening crack, and the puppet collapsed, its movements ceasing. A high-pitched, wailing sound, like a dying animal, echoed through the room. Flicker shrieked, a sound that grated on her nerves. "Fool, you cannot stop us." The others advanced. The knight, surprisingly strong, swung its tiny wooden sword. Alara parried with a long, thin chisel, its sharp point glinting. She remembered a detail from Elias's journal, a fleeting mention of the heartwood, the core of their being, the source of their binding. It was not the outer shell, but the very essence of the wood itself. She fought with a desperate ferocity she didn't know she possessed. The king and queen tried to entangle her with their long strings. The old woman and child moved with an unsettling, jerky speed. Alara used her knowledge of the workshop to her advantage, knocking over shelves, creating obstacles, buying herself precious seconds. Her eyes darted to Flicker. He was the key, the leader. If she could destroy him, perhaps the others would falter. She remembered another cryptic line from the journal. "The binding thread, woven with shadowed light, can be unraveled by pure flame." Pure flame. The hearth. She made a break for the fireplace, the puppets hot on her heels. The king's string wrapped around her ankle, pulling her down. She fell, scraping her knee, but kicked out, severing the string with the chisel. As she scrambled to her feet, Flicker was upon her, its wooden hands reaching for her throat. With a surge of adrenaline, Alara grabbed a bottle of turpentine from a shelf, splashing it onto Flicker's wooden body. The jester puppet shrieked, a sound of pure agony. Then, with a desperate lunge, she grabbed a burning log from the hearth and thrust it at Flicker. The turpentine ignited instantly. Flicker burst into flames, its painted grin twisting into a mask of true horror. The dry, rasping screams filled the workshop, a cacophony of burning wood and trapped souls. The other puppets froze, their movements jerky, their glass eyes wide with what looked like fear. As Flicker burned, its form twisting and charring, the other puppets began to shudder violently. Their strings snapped, their limbs went limp, and they collapsed to the floor, inanimate once more. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by the acrid smell of burning wood. Alara stood panting, the burning log still clutched in her hand, watching Flicker turn to ash. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by her ragged breaths and the crackle of the dying embers. The next morning, under the pale, watery light of dawn, Alara systematically gathered the remaining puppets. She did not attempt to restore them. Instead, she took them to the deepest part of the Whispering Wood, to a clearing she had never visited before. There, she dug a deep pit, and one by one, she placed the inert wooden figures into the earth. She poured salt over them, then doused them with more turpentine, and finally, with a heavy heart and trembling hand, set them alight. The flames consumed them, purifying the wood, releasing whatever lingered within. As the last embers died, she filled the pit, burying the ashes deep beneath the earth. Alara never restored another doll or puppet. The scent of linseed oil now brought a wave of nausea. The sight of a wooden face, however innocent, sent shivers down her spine. She sold the old house, unable to bear the whispers that still seemed to echo in the quiet corners, the shadows that still seemed to shift at the periphery of her vision. She moved to a small, modern apartment in the city, surrounded by concrete and the comforting cacophony of human life. But sometimes, late at night, when the city sounds faded and the silence pressed in, she would hear it a faint, dry rustle, like leaves skittering across a wooden floor, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing. The horror, she knew, was not just in the puppets themselves, but in the indelible mark they had left upon her soul. A part of Flicker, perhaps, had stitched itself into her own consciousness, a silent, grinning reminder that some horrors, once awakened, never truly sleep. The Serenity, a sleek, modern research vessel, cut through the sapphire waters of the Pacific. Dr. Eris Thorne, a marine biologist whose life was dedicated to the ocean's mysteries, stood on the deck, the salty spray a familiar kiss on his face. He inhaled deeply, the scent of salt and ozone a comforting balm. Below, his team prepared for their deep-sea expedition, a venture into the Mariana Trench, a place of crushing pressure and eternal darkness, where life was thought to be sparse, if not impossible. The sheer scale of the undertaking was daunting, a plunge into the last true frontier on Earth. Eris, however, harbored a different theory. He believed in the persistence of life, even in the most hostile environments. His current obsession was a series of anomalous sonic readings, faint but persistent, emanating from a previously uncharted section of the trench. They were too regular, too complex to be geological. They hinted at something alive, something that defied conventional understanding of deep-sea ecosystems. These readings, picked up by an experimental array of hydrophones deployed months prior, had become his waking thought and his restless dream. His team consisted of Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant but cautious oceanographer whose sharp intellect was often tempered by a healthy dose of skepticism; Ben Carter, the pragmatic and ever-joking submersible pilot whose easygoing demeanor belied a razor-sharp focus under pressure; and Maya Singh, the quiet, meticulous data analyst whose fingers danced across keyboards with an almost preternatural speed. The atmosphere on board was a mix of professional excitement and underlying apprehension, a palpable tension that hummed beneath the surface of their conversations. The trench was unforgiving, a realm where even the slightest miscalculation could mean oblivion. Their submersible, the Triton, was a marvel of engineering, a sphere of reinforced titanium and composite alloys, designed to withstand pressures that would crush a battleship into a crumpled tin can. Its external lights alone consumed enough power to illuminate a small town. As they began their descent, the sunlight faded with startling rapidity, replaced by the Triton's powerful floodlights, which pierced the growing gloom with twin beams of artificial daylight. The ocean outside transformed, from vibrant blue to a deep, ominous indigo, then to an inky black, punctuated only by the sporadic, ethereal bioluminescent flashes of strange, deep-sea creatures, ghostly jellyfish, anglerfish with their lures like malevolent stars, and unseen forms that flitted just beyond the reach of their lights. The pressure gauges climbed steadily, each increment a stark reminder of the crushing forces building around them. The sonic readings intensified as they neared their target depth. They were rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, but far too slow, too deep to be anything known. It was less a sound and more a vibration, a resonant thrum that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly in their chests. Lena adjusted the hydrophones, her brow furrowed in concentration, her usual caution replaced by a growing fascination. Eris, these aren't just sounds. They're patterns, like communication, and they're incredibly low frequency, almost infrasound. Something truly massive would be needed to generate this. Ben, ever the practical one, scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. Communication? Down here? From what? Giant squid playing charades. Or maybe the trench itself is just having a bad day. But even his joke held a tremor of unease. Eris, however, felt a thrill of anticipation that bordered on reverence. Perhaps something far older, Ben. something that has adapted beyond our wildest imaginings, something that has thrived in this darkness for millennia, evolving in ways we can barely conceive. He leaned closer to the sonar screen, his eyes gleaming. They reached the floor of the trench, a vast, desolate plain of volcanic rock, jagged fissures, and hydrothermal vents that spewed superheated, mineral-rich water into the frigid abyss. The Triton's lights revealed a landscape alien and stark, a silent, primordial world that had remained unchanged for millions of years. And then, Maya's voice, a hushed whisper that cut through the hum of the submersible systems, broke the profound silence. Movement, large, very large, directly ahead. And it's not a single echo. It's a complex, undulating mass. The sonar screen flared with a massive, elongated shape, far larger than any known marine creature. It was moving slowly, deliberately, towards them, its scale almost incomprehensible. The sheer size of the blip on the screen made their breath catch in their throats. "Ben, full stop," Eris commanded, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Lena, get a visual."
Max magnification.
Lena's fingers flew across the console, manipulating the external cameras. The image on the main screen flickered, then resolved into something that made their blood run cold, a sight that would forever haunt their nightmares. It was a shark, but not just any shark. This creature was immense, easily twice the size of a great white, perhaps even 3 times, its body a ghostly, pale gray, almost translucent in the submersible's lights. Its skin was ancient, scarred by untold battles with unseen horrors of the deep, covered in what looked like phosphorescent barnacles that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, like a constellation of malevolent stars. Its eyes, however, were the most terrifying feature. They were not the dead, black, unseeing eyes of a typical shark, but large, intelligent orbs, glowing with an internal predatory light that seemed to pierce the Triton's hull and look directly into their souls. And its teeth. They were not merely rows of jagged points, but massive obsidian blades, some broken, others unnaturally long, like ancient daggers, each one capable of shearing through steel. "My God!" Lena breathed, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a megalodon? No, it's too big. And those eyes, they're aware." The creature circled them, its movements slow, deliberate, almost curious. It wasn't attacking, not yet. It was observing, assessing, like a colossal hunter studying its prey. The rhythmic thrumming, the heartbeat, seemed to emanate directly from it. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the Triton's hull, a sound that seemed to bypass their ears and resonate within their very bones. "It's not just a shark," Eris whispered, a chilling realization dawning on him, a cold dread seeping into his veins. "It's evolved, adapted to this environment. It's using echolocation, but something more, something that allows it to perceive us, perhaps even our thoughts. It's reading us." Suddenly, the Triton shuddered. The shark had gently nudged them, a colossal, silent inquiry. The pressure outside was immense, and even a gentle touch from such a creature felt like a hammer blow, a warning. The submersible creaked in protest. "It's trying to communicate," Maya said, her voice barely audible, her fingers trembling as they hovered over her keyboard. "The patterns, they're becoming more complex. It's not just sound. It's a language, a very old language." Eris, driven by a desperate scientific curiosity that momentarily eclipsed his fear, activated the external microphone, attempting to broadcast a series of simple tones, a basic greeting. The shark responded instantly, its hum intensifying, the patterns shifting, becoming more intricate, more demanding. It was a terrifying, exhilarating moment of first contact, a bridge across an unimaginable evolutionary chasm. But then the hum changed. It became agitated, sharper, filled with a deep, resonant growl that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly in their bones, a sound of profound displeasure. The shark's glowing eyes narrowed, its massive body tensing, its movements no longer curious but menacing. "It's angry," Lena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What did you do, Eris?" What did you say? I don't know, he stammered, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. I just tried to respond, tried to acknowledge it. The Triton lurched violently as the shark slammed into them, not with a gentle nudge, but with the full, unbridled force of its immense body. Alarms blared, a cacophony of red lights and piercing sirens. Lights flickered, then died in sections of the submersible. Hull integrity compromised, Ben yelled, wrestling with the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. We're losing power to the main thrusters. Auxiliary power failing. The shark attacked again, its obsidian teeth scraping against the Triton's reinforced hull, producing a horrific screech that echoed inside the submersible, a sound of metal tearing and grinding. The creature wasn't just attacking. It seemed to be trying to pry them open, like a colossal predator cracking a nut, its intelligence focused on breaching their defenses. It wants in, Maya whispered, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the monstrous eye outside the viewport. It wants us. It's not just curious. It's hunting. Eris's mind flashed back to the old workshop, to Elias Thorne's journal, and the hunger of the puppets for flesh and blood. This creature, this ancient leviathan, had the same hunger, but on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. It wasn't just a beast. It was an intelligence, an ancient, malevolent will that had survived in the crushing darkness, evolving to become the ultimate predator, a living embodiment of the abyss.
Ben, evasive maneuvers.
Anything, full reverse, divert all remaining power to the thrusters. Eris shouted, but the Triton was sluggish, hampered by the damage, its systems failing one by one. The shark hit them again, this time tearing away a section of the external plating near the stern. Water began to seep in, a thin, chilling stream that quickly became a steady trickle. The pressure outside was immense, and even a small breach was catastrophic. The submersible groaned, its metal shell groaning under the strain. We have to ascend, Lena screamed, her voice bordering on hysteria, her hands pressed against the cold metal of the console. Now, before it's too late. Ben fought the controls, his knuckles white, the Triton protesting with every movement. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to rise, the damaged thrusters struggling against the immense water resistance. But the shark was relentless. It followed, a pale, glowing phantom in the darkness, its hum a constant, terrifying presence, growing louder with every meter they ascended. It was faster than they expected, its massive tail propelling it with surprising speed, an impossible agility for a creature of its size. It struck again, this time at the Triton's primary propulsion system, the massive propellers at the rear. A sickening crunch, a sound of twisting metal and shattering components. The submersible lurched violently, then began to spin, tumbling uncontrollably through the black water. Lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the faint, eerie glow of the shark's eyes outside, which seemed to penetrate the very hull. Emergency power, Eris yelled, fumbling for the backup controls, his fingers brushing against cold, unresponsive switches. A single, weak light flickered on, illuminating their terrified faces, casting long, dancing shadows. The hum was now deafening, a resonant vibration that filled the submersible, making their teeth ache, their very bones vibrate. The shark was right outside, its massive eye pressed against the viewport, staring in, an intelligent, ancient gaze that promised only oblivion. And then the hum changed again. It was no longer angry, but a low, resonant purr, a sound of deep satisfaction, of anticipation. And within it, Eris heard something else, something that wasn't sound, but a thought, a primal, ancient hunger that resonated directly in his mind, bypassing his ears, invading his consciousness. We have waited. We are hungry. We are the deep. And you are merely a taste of the surface. The Triton groaned, its metal hull protesting, the sound of tearing metal growing louder. A hairline crack appeared in the main viewport, spiderwebbing outwards with terrifying speed, a delicate, deadly pattern of impending doom. It's going to break through, Lena shrieked, pressing herself against the console, her eyes squeezed shut. "We're going to be crushed." Ben, surprisingly calm in the face of absolute terror, grabbed a flare gun, his hands steady. "If we're going down," he said, his voice grim, "we're taking a piece of it with us." He aimed the flare gun at the glowing eye, a futile gesture against such a monstrous adversary. Eris knew it was futile. This creature was beyond flares, beyond human weapons, beyond any defense they could mount. It was a force of nature, an apex predator that had mastered the abyss, a being that had existed in the crushing darkness for eons, waiting for its moment. The crack widened, a jagged line across the viewport. Water began to spray in, a fine, cold mist that quickly turned into a torrent. The pressure was building, the submersible groaning like a dying beast, its internal structure beginning to buckle. The shark's hum intensified, filling their minds, drowning out their screams, their last, desperate breaths. It was a symphony of hunger, a song of the deep, a lullaby of annihilation. Eris felt his consciousness blurring, his thoughts becoming one with the resonant hum. He saw images in his mind. Vast, ancient oceans, countless eons of silent predation, the endless, crushing darkness. He saw other shapes, other glowing eyes, lurking in the abyss, waiting. Not just one, many, an entire lineage of these leviathans, slumbering in the unfathomable depths, awakened by their intrusion. The viewport shattered. The last thing Eris saw was the massive, glowing eye of the shark, inches from his face, and the gaping maw filled with obsidian blades, rushing towards him. The crushing pressure, the icy water, the primal hunger, it all consumed him in an instant, a final, terrifying embrace from the deep. The Serenity waited on the surface, its crew scanning the empty expanse of the Pacific. Days turned into weeks. The Triton was never found. The anomalous sonic readings from the Mariana Trench ceased, as if the very abyss had swallowed them whole. The ocean returned to its deceptive calm, its surface shimmering innocently under the sun. But sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the moon was hidden and the ocean was a vast, black mirror, sailors reported hearing it. A faint, deep hum, resonating from the depths. A sound that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten eons and an insatiable hunger. And sometimes, just sometimes, they saw it. A fleeting pale glow beneath the waves. A pair of intelligent predatory eyes, watching, waiting, for the next vessel to venture into the deep. The ocean, after all, held secrets far older and far more terrifying than humanity could ever comprehend. And some of those secrets, once awakened, never truly sleep. They only wait for the next meal, the next unsuspecting soul to fall into the deep's embrace. The city of Viridia was a labyrinth of shadowed alleys and towering, rain-slicked spires, a place where secrets were currency and death, a profession. Its neon glow, a false promise of vibrancy, merely highlighted the deeper, pervasive gloom. Elias Vance, known only as the Wraith in the hushed whispers of the underworld, was its most sought-after practitioner. He moved like smoke, leaving no trace, his victims often unaware of their demise until the cold embrace of oblivion claimed them. His tools were silence, precision, and an unnerving ability to blend into the urban tapestry, becoming just another shadow among countless shadows, an unseen predator in a concrete jungle. Elias lived in a forgotten attic apartment, high above the city's ceaseless hum, a solitary eyrie from which he observed the world. His sanctuary was stark, minimalist, reflecting his own existence. A cot, a small table, a meticulously organized array of blades, each one a work of deadly art, and a single, unadorned window overlooking the sprawling, indifferent metropolis. He preferred the quiet solitude, the rhythmic drip of rain on the skylight, the distant wail of sirens that never quite reached his elevated haven. He was a creature of habit, his days and nights a carefully orchestrated dance of rigorous physical training, exhaustive surveillance, and the chilling execution of contracts. His mind, as sharp and honed as his blades, was a fortress against emotion, a necessary defense in his line of work. His current target was a reclusive industrialist named Kalen Thorne, rumored to possess a ledger detailing the city's most illicit dealings, a document that could unravel the very fabric of Viridia's power structure. The contract was simple: retrieve the ledger, eliminate Thorne. Elias had spent weeks observing Thorne's fortified penthouse, a monolithic structure that seemed to pierce the very clouds. He had meticulously mapped out every security detail, every guard patrol, every potential entry and exit point, every flaw in the seemingly impenetrable defense. He was a master of planning, leaving absolutely nothing to chance. His success built on an obsessive attention to detail. The night of the assassination was a symphony of wind and rain, a perfect cloak for his movements. The storm raged, lashing against the skyscraper's glass and steel, muffling the distant city sounds. Elias scaled the sheer face of Thorne's skyscraper, his specialized gear biting into the wet stone, each grapple and ascent a testament to years of training. His breath was a controlled whisper in the howling gale, his heart a steady drum against his ribs. He moved with a dancer's grace, each movement economical, precise, a shadow against the storm-swept sky. He breached the penthouse's reinforced windows, the high-tech locking mechanisms yielding silently to his touch, slipping inside like a phantom, leaving no trace of his intrusion. The penthouse was a mausoleum of immense wealth, filled with dark, polished with that gleamed dully in the ambient light, priceless artifacts from forgotten civilizations, and an oppressive, almost suffocating silence that swallowed every sound. Elias moved through it, his senses heightened, every nerve alive, attuned to the slightest anomaly. He bypassed laser grids that crisscrossed hallways like invisible spiderwebs, pressure plates hidden beneath opulent rugs, and motion sensors disguised as decorative elements, all with practiced ease and an almost instinctual understanding of their weaknesses. He found Thorne in his study, a cavernous room lined with ancient, leather-bound books and intricate, hand-drawn maps of long-lost territories. Thorne was hunched over a massive mahogany desk, a single, flickering oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls, giving the room an unsettling, almost theatrical quality. The infamous ledger lay open before him, its pages filled with dense, arcane script. Elias raised his blade, a sliver of moonlight filtering through a break in the clouds, glinting off its razor edge, a silent promise of oblivion. He moved behind Thorne, silent as a breath, a predator closing in on its unsuspecting prey. But just as the blade began its descent, a mere whisper from its target, Thorne spoke, his voice a low, raspy murmur that seemed to fill the vast room, resonating in the very air. "I've been expecting you, Wraith." Elias froze, his blade suspended inches from Thorne's neck. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. No one knew his moniker, not truly. He was a ghost, a myth, a whisper on the wind. Thorne slowly turned, his movements deliberate, unhurried, his eyes, dark and knowing, fixed on Elias with an unnerving intensity. There was no fear in them, only a chilling resignation, and something else, a profound, ancient weariness, as if he had witnessed countless cycles of life and death. "You're not the first," Thorne continued, his gaze drifting past Elias, towards the shadowed corners of the study, as if addressing unseen presences. "They always send more. They always think they can take what is mine, but they never learn." His voice was devoid of malice, merely stating a fact, a truth etched into the very fabric of this place. A cold dread, unfamiliar and unsettling, prickled at Elias's skin, a sensation that crawled up his spine. He was the hunter, not the hunted. He was the one who instilled fear, who commanded the shadows. Yet, in Thorne's presence, he felt a strange, primal unease, a sense of being utterly outmatched, exposed. "The ledger," Elias stated, his voice flat, professional, a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Where is it?" Thorne chuckled, a dry, rattling sound, like brittle leaves skittering across stone. "The ledger is merely bait, Wraith. A lure for those who seek to control what cannot be controlled. A whisper of power that draws the greedy, the ambitious, the foolish. He gestured vaguely at the room, a sweeping motion that encompassed the oppressive shadows. They are here, always here, watching, waiting. Elias's eyes narrowed, scanning the deeper recesses of the room. He was alone in the room with Thorn. He had checked. He scanned the shadows again, his hand tightening on his blade, his senses screaming at him that something was profoundly wrong. "Who?" he demanded, his voice edged with a growing suspicion. "The others?" Thorn whispered, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible level, a conspiratorial murmur. "The ones who came before. The ones who failed. The ones who thought they could take what was not theirs." A faint chill permeated the air, colder than the night's rain. A sudden drop in temperature that made Elias's breath mist. He felt a subtle shift in the shadows, a fleeting impression of movement at the edge of his vision, like a ripple in still water. He dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the light, the strain of his long vigil. He had been awake for days, meticulously planning this, and his mind was undoubtedly playing tricks on him. He lunged, his blade a silver blur, a desperate attempt to break the unsettling spell Thorn had cast. Thorn made no move to defend himself, merely watched with those unnerving, knowing eyes, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips. The blade sliced through the air, a whisper of steel, but just before it connected, a sudden, invisible force slammed into Elias, a shockwave of pure, raw energy. He was thrown across the room with brutal force, hitting a heavy bookshelf with a jarring, bone-rattling thud, books raining down around him like a cascade of ancient knowledge. He scrambled to his feet, disoriented but miraculously unharmed, his mind reeling. Thorn was still sitting at his desk, perfectly composed, a faint, melancholic smile on his lips, as if he had anticipated every move. "They protect me," Thorn said, his voice now imbued with a strange, resonant quality, a deep hum that vibrated in Elias's chest. "They have for a very long time, for centuries perhaps, and they are displeased with your intrusion, displeased with your intent." The shadows in the room deepened, coalescing into vague, humanoid forms, not solid, but undeniably present. Elias saw them now, not clearly, but as distortions in the air, shimmering outlines that seemed to absorb the ambient light, drawing it into their spectral forms. They were silent, utterly still, yet their presence was overwhelming, radiating an ancient, malevolent cold that seeped into his very bones, a profound sense of despair and forgotten rage. "What are you?" Elias demanded, his voice hoarse, his carefully cultivated composure finally cracking, revealing the raw fear beneath. "The echoes?" Thorn replied, his smile widening, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous, glinting like shards of obsidian in the dim lamplight. "The echoes of those who sought to take what was not theirs. The echoes of assassins. Your predecessors, Wraith. Your brothers in ambition and failure." Elias realized with a sickening jolt of horror, a cold wave washing over him, that Thorn wasn't protected by living guards, by flesh and blood. He was protected by the spectral remnants of every assassin who had ever failed to kill him. Their failed attempts, their final agonizing moments, had somehow bound them to this place, to Thorn, becoming his eternal spectral guardians, an invisible, unholy army. A chilling whisper, dry and rustling, filled the room, seeming to come from all directions at once, a chorus of spectral voices. "He is one of us now. He will join us. He will serve." One of the shadowy forms detached itself from the wall, drifting towards Elias with an unnatural, gliding motion. It was vaguely human-shaped, but distorted, its limbs elongated, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if permanently broken. Elias felt a sudden, inexplicable coldness in his right hand, the hand holding his blade. He looked down. His fingers were turning translucent, shimmering like heat haze, becoming insubstantial. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized him, a primal scream trapped in his throat. He tried to move, to run, to escape this living nightmare, but his legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot, held by an unseen force. The shadowy form reached him, its ethereal hand passing through his own, a sensation of profound, agonizing cold. A jolt of unimaginable pain shot through him, a sensation of his very essence being drained, pulled away, unraveling like a frayed thread. He screamed, a sound that was instantly muffled, absorbed by the oppressive silence of the room, by the hungry whispers of the echoes. He felt himself dissolving, his physical form becoming less substantial, his vision blurring, the edges of the room melting into a swirling vortex of shadow. He saw Thorn, still smiling, still watching, his eyes reflecting the growing horror in Elias's own, a silent witness to his damnation. The whispers intensified, a chorus of dry, rustling voices, growing louder, more insistent, filling his fading consciousness. Join us, become one of us, protect the Master, forever. Elias fought, a desperate, futile struggle against an unseen force, against the inevitable. He tried to lash out, to strike, to sever the invisible bonds that were pulling him apart, but his blade passed through the shadowy forms as if they were made of smoke, useless against the incorporeal. His body continued to fade, his senses dimming, the world around him receding into a gray haze. He felt the cold embrace of the shadows, pulling him into their ranks, binding him to this cursed penthouse, to an eternal vigil. His last coherent thought was of his attic apartment, his sanctuary, the quiet solitude he had cherished, the only place he had ever truly felt safe. It was gone now, replaced by an eternal vigil in a gilded cage, a silent, endless torment. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sun rose over Viridia, casting long golden shadows across the city, illuminating its towers and its hidden alleys. Kalen Thorne's penthouse stood silent, undisturbed, a beacon of impenetrable mystery. No alarms had sounded, no shots had been fired, no struggle had been heard. The city's elite would assume Thorne's security was simply impenetrable, his wealth a shield against all threats. Inside the study, the ledger remained open on the desk, its pages still filled with the secrets of Viridia's underworld. Kalen Thorne was still seated, his eyes closed, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. He was old, and very tired, a prisoner of his own power, cursed to live forever, protected by the very souls he had condemned. And in the deepest shadows of the room, barely perceptible to the human eye, a new, faint distortion shimmered. It was vaguely human-shaped, its form still forming, its essence still solidifying into the eternal, silent guardianship. It was Elias Vance, the Wraith, now just another echo in Thorne's grim collection, another silent sentinel in the unholy orchestra. The whispers continued, a perpetual, dry rustle in the silence, a constant, chilling hum that only Thorne could truly hear. Another one, always another one, and the collection grows. The cycle continued. The city's underworld would send more assassins, drawn by the lure of the ledger, the promise of power, the irresistible pull of Viridia's dark heart. And each time, they would meet the same fate, becoming another silent guardian, another echo in Thorne's macabre sanctuary. The penthouse was not just a residence. It was a trap, a living tomb for those who sought to penetrate its secrets, a monument to their failures. Kalen Thorne knew this. He had orchestrated it, perhaps even desired it. His ancient existence sustained by the very fear and ambition of those who sought to end him. He was not merely a target. He was the keeper of a terrible secret, a living anomaly in a city built on death. He was the conductor of a silent orchestra of spectral assassins, bound to him by their own failure, their eternal torment his perpetual shield. His life was a prolonged, agonizing existence, waiting for the next attempt, the next addition to his spectral guard, a prisoner of his own power. And in the heart of Viridia, the whispers of the Wraith were replaced by a new, faint echo, joining the chorus of the damned. a silent lament in the unholy symphony. The silent blade had found its eternal rest, not in the ground, but in the echoing fear of Thorn's unholy protection. The city, unaware of the true horror lurking in its highest spire, continued its ceaseless hum, its secrets guarded by the spectral remnants of its most feared killers, forever bound to their master, forever trapped in the silent blade and the echoing fear. The air crackled with anticipation, thick with the intoxicating scent of high-octane fuel, burnt rubber, and the nervous sweat of 1,000 spectators. The Midnight Grand Prix, an unsanctioned, underground race, was less an event and more a legend, whispered about in the dark corners of the racing world. It wasn't about prize money or fleeting fame. It was about proving you were the fastest, the most fearless, the one who could tame the treacherous, winding roads of the Blackwood Pass. And, as whispered in hushed tones that carried the weight of ancient dread, it was about surviving the pass itself, a place where the road seemed to consume those who dared to challenge it. Rory Kincaid, a man whose life was a blur of speed and adrenaline, whose very pulse seemed to beat in time with a revving engine, gripped the steering wheel of his custom-built Phantom, a sleek, raven-black machine that purred with barely contained power, a predator waiting to be unleashed. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a familiar drumbeat before a race, a symphony of anticipation and controlled fear. But tonight, there was a different note in the symphony of his nerves, a discordant hum of unease that resonated deep within his bones. He'd heard the rumors, the chilling tales of drivers who vanished without a trace, of cars found mangled beyond recognition with no bodies inside, of spectral lights dancing in the rearview mirror, mocking the living. He usually scoffed at such superstitions, dismissing them as the fanciful ramblings of the weak-minded. But the atmosphere tonight was different, heavy with an almost tangible dread that clung to the air like the humidity before a storm. His rivals lined up beside him, their machines gleaming under the harsh floodlights, each a testament to engineering and a hunger for victory. There was Viper Valerius, a cold-eyed veteran with a reputation for ruthless aggression, whose steely gaze promised no quarter. Blaze Brennan, a flamboyant newcomer whose recklessness was matched only by his blistering speed, a wild card in every race, and the enigmatic Shadow, a driver whose identity was unknown, always clad in black from head to toe, their car a featureless, matte gray blur, a silent, almost invisible menace on the track. The tension was a living thing, a coiled serpent ready to strike. The starting gun cracked, a sharp, deafening report that echoed through the night, slicing through the roar of the crowd. Engines roared, a collective beast unleashed, a primal scream of power. Tires shrieked, biting into the asphalt with desperate urgency, leaving smoking trails in their wake, and the cars launched forward, a kaleidoscope of speed and light, blurring into streaks against the dark backdrop of the pass. Rory pushed the Phantom, feeling the raw power surge through him, the acceleration pinning him back against his seat, becoming one with the machine, a seamless extension of steel and speed. Blackwood Pass lived up to its ominous name. The road was a serpentine nightmare, a ribbon of asphalt clinging precariously to the side of a sheer cliff face, dropping into a bottomless gorge on one side, a gaping maw of darkness, and rising to a dense, ancient forest on the other, its trees like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Hairpin turns followed blind crests with cruel regularity, and the narrow asphalt offered no forgiveness for error, no mercy for the hesitant. The moonlight, when it broke through the heavy, scudding clouds, cast eerie shadows that danced and writhed, playing tricks on the eyes, transforming familiar shapes into grotesque specters. Rory was in his element, his instincts honed by years of pushing limits, his reflexes a blur of precision. He took the first few turns with practiced precision, his tires kissing the very edge of disaster, the cliff face a blurred wall beside him, his mind a calculating machine, processing every variable, every nuance of the road. He passed Blaze, whose car skidded dangerously close to the cliff edge, a near miss that sent a jolt through Rory, even as he focused on his own line. He saw Viper's determined face in his rearview mirror, a grim mask of concentration, a relentless hunter on his tail. Then, the first anomaly occurred, subtle at first, easily dismissed. As he rounded a particularly tight bend known as Widow's Kiss, a faint, ethereal glow appeared in his rearview mirror, not from a car's headlights, but a soft, pulsing luminescence, like a distant, dying star. It was behind Shadow's car, which was currently a few lengths back, a silent, unsettling companion. Rory blinked, shaking his head, trying to clear his vision. Just the glare of the lights, he told himself. Fatigue, perhaps, playing tricks on his overstimulated mind. But the glow persisted, growing brighter, seeming to pulse with a life of its own, an internal rhythm that defied explanation. It wasn't static. It moved, weaving and darting behind Shadow's vehicle, almost like a phantom passenger, a silent observer in the deadly race. Rory frowned, a knot forming in his stomach, pushing the thought aside with a desperate effort. Focus on the road. Focus on the race. He pulled ahead of Shadow, the Phantom's engine screaming in protest as he redlined it, pushing the machine to its absolute breaking point. As he glanced in his mirror again, the glow was still there, but now it was closer, directly behind him, a shimmering, indistinct form in the periphery of his vision, just beyond the edge of clear sight. He felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature inside the cockpit, a chilling cold that seeped into his bones despite the roaring heat of the engine and his own adrenaline-fueled body. A profound shiver traced its way down his spine, a premonition of something terrible. The whispers began then, faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves in a forgotten wind, or the distant murmur of a restless crowd. They weren't words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry clicks, faint sighs, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of the gorge. It seemed to emanate from the very air around him, from the shadows clinging to the ancient trees, from the endless blackness of the gorge below. Rory gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the dark leather, his heart hammering a frantic, irregular beat. The adrenaline that usually sharpened his senses now seemed to amplify his unease, turning every shadow into a lurking threat. He pushed the Phantom harder, the speedometer needle trembling at its maximum, trying to outrun the unsettling presence, to leave the whispers and the cold behind. The glow in his mirror intensified, becoming a swirling vortex of pale light, growing more defined, more menacing. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, forming fragmented, chilling phrases that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity. Faster, not fast enough, you can't escape, we are waiting. Ahead, Blaze's car suddenly swerved violently, its tires losing traction with a desperate shriek that cut through the night. It spun once, twice, a chaotic dance of metal and light, then veered off the road with a sickening crunch, disappearing into the black maw of the gorge. No explosion, no fiery wreckage, no sign of life. Just silence, profound and absolute, where a moment before there had been the roar of an engine. Rory's blood ran cold, a chilling realization dawning on him. Blaze was known for his recklessness, but not for such a catastrophic, unforced error. It was as if something had pulled him off the road, an invisible hand guiding him to his doom. The glow in Rory's mirror pulsed, brighter now, an almost blinding luminescence, and the whispers coalesced into a chilling chorus, 1,000 voices speaking as one. One down. Who's next? The past hungers. It always hungers. He glanced at his GPS, his eyes darting from the road to the flickering screen. He was nearing Devil's Backbone, a series of treacherous S-curves notorious for claiming unwary drivers, a section of the road that demanded absolute precision. He saw Viper's car ahead, a red streak against the darkness, a defiant challenge to the lurking horror. Rory pushed the Phantom to its absolute limit, the engine screaming in protest, a banshee wail in the night, the tires barely holding traction as the car danced on the edge of control. As he entered Devil's Backbone, the glowing entity in his mirror seemed to expand, filling his entire rear view, its form becoming clearer, more terrifying. He could almost make out a skeletal, elongated shape within it, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its empty eye sockets fixed on him with an ancient, malevolent gaze. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a dry, rasping chorus directly in his ears. Inside his head, 1,000 voices screaming his name, demanding his surrender. We ride with you, Rory Kincaid. We ride with all who dare to challenge the past. And we claim our due. Your soul, your essence, your eternity. He felt a sudden, inexplicable drag on the steering wheel, a subtle resistance that fought against his every input, a powerful, unseen force trying to wrest control from him. The Phantom began to veer, inching closer to the sheer cliff edge, the abyss beckoning. Rory wrestled with the wheel, his muscles screaming in protest, his arms burning with the effort. It was as if an invisible hand, cold and strong, was trying to force him off the road, to join the others. He saw Viper's car ahead, struggling with the same unseen force. Viper's vehicle was fishtailing wildly, its tires smoking, its driver fighting a desperate battle against an unseen adversary, a silent, unseen battle for his very life. Then, with a final, agonizing shriek of tortured metal, Viper's car was violently ripped from the road, not swerving, but literally lifted and hurled into the abyss. A silent, sickening plummet into the darkness, a flash of red disappearing into the void. Rory screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror that tore from his throat, swallowed by the roar of the wind and the whispers. He was alone now, the last one. The glowing entity was no longer just in his mirror. It was in the passenger seat, a shimmering, translucent form, its skeletal fingers, long and bony, reaching for the wheel, for his throat. The whispers were a deafening roar in his mind, 1,000 voices screaming his name, demanding his soul, promising an eternity of torment. Join us, Rory. Become one of us. Ride the past forever. Feel the wind. Feel the cold. Feel the endless hunger. He felt the cold, spectral touch on his arm, a sensation of icy dread that seeped into his very bones, chilling him to the core. His vision blurred, the road ahead twisting and distorting into a grotesque mockery of reality. He was losing control not just of the car, but of his own mind, his sanity fraying at the edges. The entity was trying to possess him, to make him another echo in the past's grim collection, another spectral driver bound to this cursed road. He remembered the rumors, the stories of drivers who vanished. They didn't crash. They were taken. Their cars found empty, their souls bound to the past, forced to ride forever, spectral guardians of this cursed road, luring new victims into the same inescapable fate. The past was a living entity, a hungry maw that devoured souls. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, a final, defiant spark of life, Rory fought back. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, pushing the Phantom beyond its limits, beyond what he thought was possible, a desperate gamble for survival. The car surged forward, a black bullet against the night, a defiant streak against the encroaching darkness. He swerved violently, hoping to dislodge the entity, to break its hold, to shake off the spectral grip. The entity shrieked, a sound like grinding stones, a sound of pure agony, its hold momentarily weakening, its form flickering like a dying flame. Rory saw his chance, a sliver of hope in the overwhelming darkness. He remembered a legend, a forgotten tale of the past, whispered by old-timers around dying campfires. The ancient ones fear the light of the dawn and the true sound of life. They cannot abide the vibrant pulse of the living. He fumbled for his phone, his trembling fingers barely able to unlock it, fumbling with the touchscreen. He opened a music app, selecting a track, not a racing anthem, not a metal roar, but a vibrant, pulsating electronic beat, full of life and energy, a defiant pulse against the deathly silence. He cranked the volume to maximum, the speakers blasting the defiant rhythm into the confined space of the cockpit, the bass vibrating through the very chassis of the car. The effect was instantaneous. The glowing entity recoiled, its form flickering violently, its whispers turning into a cacophony of pained shrieks, 1,000 tormented voices crying out in agony. The music, a vibrant pulse of life, a defiant beat of human creation, was anathema to its spectral existence, a burning light against its shadow. Rory pressed his advantage, pushing the phantom even harder, the music a shield against the encroaching darkness, a barrier against the whispers. He saw the faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon, a thin sliver of gray light breaking through the oppressive blackness, painting the sky with the promise of a new day. The entity shrieked again, its form shrinking, its power waning, dissolving into wisps of shadow. As the first direct rays of sunlight touched the treacherous road, bathing the pass in a gentle golden glow, the glowing entity in his passenger seat dissolved completely, fading into nothingness like mist in the morning sun. The whispers died, replaced by the roar of the phantom's engine and the frantic, pounding rhythm of his own heart, a testament to his survival. Rory drove on, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind reeling from the ordeal, the phantom chill still clinging to his skin. He reached the makeshift finish line, a solitary victor in a race that had claimed all others, a survivor of an unseen horror. He pulled the phantom to a screeching halt, collapsing against the steering wheel, gasping for breath, the taste of fear still bitter on his tongue. He never raced again. The thrill of speed was gone, replaced by the chilling, indelible memory of the spectral riders of Blackwood Pass. He sold the phantom, unable to bear its presence, its silent reminder of the night he had cheated death and glimpsed the true horror of the road, a horror that lurked just beyond the veil of perception. Years passed. Rory lived a quiet life, far from the roar of engines and the whispers of the wind, seeking solace in the mundane, in the comforting predictability of everyday life. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside his window, a sound that once brought him peace, he would hear it a faint, dry rustle, like leaves skittering across asphalt, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing, a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of his memory. He knew the past still called, still claimed its due, still hungered for new souls. And he knew that somewhere, in the eternal darkness of Blackwood Pass, the spectral drivers still raced, their phantom cars a blur of light and shadow, waiting for the next brave fool to challenge their domain, forever trapped in the midnight Grand Prix, forever riding the cursed road. The train car was a coffin on wheels, a suffocating metal box crammed with bodies pressed so close that breathing became a collective, desperate effort. Each gasp for air was a shared agony, each exhalation a cloud of fear and stale breath. Elias, a scholar whose life had once been defined by the quiet rustle of ancient texts, the scent of aged parchment, and the serene solitude of his study, now found his world reduced to the rhythmic, hypnotic clatter of the wheels on the tracks and the acrid, cloying stench of fear, unwashed humanity, and something else, something vaguely metallic like old blood. Each jolt of the carriage was a hammer blow against his dwindling hope, a physical manifestation of the relentless journey into the unknown. They were heading east, deeper into the heart of a continent consumed by madness, deeper into the maw of the war, a journey from which few returned. Whispers, thin and brittle as old paper, circulated through the cramped space, passed from trembling lip to trembling ear. Auschwitz, work camp, re-education, resettlement. No one dared speak the true, unspoken terror that lurked beneath those euphemisms, the chilling reality that gnawed at their collective consciousness. When the doors finally groaned open, a blast of frigid, biting air, thick with the smell of ash, human waste, and that same metallic tang, assaulted them. It was a physical blow, stealing their breath, stinging their eyes. The sky above was a perpetual, suffocating gray, a vast, oppressive blanket that pressed down on a landscape of stark, skeletal trees, endless rows of barbed wire fences, menacing watchtowers with their cold, unblinking eyes, and a sprawling, desolate expanse of barracks that stretched to the horizon. This was not a place of work, not a place of re-education. It was a place of systematic dehumanization, a factory of despair, designed to break the spirit before it broke the body. The first horror was the silence, not the serene silence of peace or the comforting quiet of a library, but a heavy, unnatural quiet, a profound absence of human sound, broken only by the barked, guttural commands of the guards, the distant clang of metal on metal, and the shuffling, dragging cadence of thousands of defeated feet. It was the silence of suppressed screams, of unspoken agony, of souls slowly being extinguished, a silence that hummed with unshed tears and unvoiced prayers. Elias was stripped of his name, his clothes, his dignity. He became a number, a series of digits tattooed onto his forearm, a brand of ownership, a mark of his reduction from a man to an item. His days merged into an endless, monotonous cycle of grueling, senseless labor, meager, watery rations that barely sustained life, and the constant, gnawing fear of the unknown, the ever-present threat of arbitrary violence or sudden, inexplicable disappearance. The guards, with their impassive faces and their cold, dead eyes, were not human. They were extensions of the camp itself, instruments of its insidious will, devoid of empathy or mercy. Their boots crunched on the gravel, a sound that became synonymous with terror. But the true horror Elias soon discovered was not just the physical torment, the hunger, the cold, the beatings. It was the insidious, creeping dread that permeated every fiber of the camp, a psychological miasma that slowly, relentlessly eroded the mind, stripping away hope, reason, and eventually, identity itself. It was the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen, even in broad daylight, coiling around the barracks like hungry serpents, clinging to the watchtowers like grotesque gargoyles. It was the faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to drift on the wind, just at the edge of hearing. When no one was speaking, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to carry ancient secrets. He started noticing things, small at first, easily dismissed. The faces of the prisoners, already gaunt and hollow, seemed to subtly shift in the dim, flickering light of the barracks, their eyes sometimes reflecting a fleeting, unnatural gleam, a spark that was not of this world. The numbers tattooed on their arms, he swore, sometimes pulsed faintly, as if with an internal, malevolent energy, a silent, living brand. He dismissed it as exhaustion, as the slow unraveling of his own sanity in this hellish environment, a defense mechanism of a mind pushed to its breaking point. One night, huddled on his hard bunk, shivering despite the meager blanket, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. They were not words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry rustles, faint clicks, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter. A cruel, mocking sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the barracks, from the cold, damp earth beneath, from the very air itself. The air around him grew noticeably colder, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into his very marrow, even with the feeble warmth of his own breath. He saw them then, in the deepest shadows of the barracks, at the periphery of his vision. Vague, humanoid forms, shimmering distortions in the air, barely perceptible, like heat haze on a summer road, but undeniably present. They were like the shadows themselves, but with a chilling sentience, a malevolent awareness. They moved silently, drifting between the sleeping forms, their presence radiating an ancient, malevolent cold that seeped into his very bones, a profound sense of despair and forgotten rage. These were the echoes, as the oldest prisoners whispered in hushed, terrified tones, their voices barely audible above the sounds of their own trembling. The remnants of those who had died here, not just physically, but spiritually. Their souls trapped by the sheer weight of despair, by the unholy energy of the camp, by the countless atrocities committed within its fences, bound to this place, unable to find rest, condemned to an eternal torment. They were the silent witnesses, the eternal sufferers, and now something more. They were the camp's true inhabitants, its silent, unseen wardens, its spectral wardens. They were the ones who ensured no one truly escaped, not even in death, for death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment. The echoes were drawn to fear, to despair, to the raw, unfiltered agony of the living. They fed on it, growing stronger, more defined, their forms coalescing from mere distortions into almost solid apparitions. They were the camp's true inhabitants, its silent, unseen wardens, its malevolent heart. They were the ones who ensured no one truly escaped, not even in death, for death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment. Elias tried to rationalize it. Hallucinations, sleep deprivation, the mind's desperate attempt to cope with unimaginable horror, to create a tangible enemy in a world of intangible terror. But the cold was real, the whispers were real, and the growing sense of being watched, constantly, relentlessly, by unseen eyes, was terrifyingly, irrevocably real. The echoes began to interact, not physically, but subtly, insidiously. A prisoner might suddenly stumble, as if pushed by an unseen hand, falling into the mud or against a barbed wire fence. A meager ration of bread, clutched desperately, might vanish from a starving man's grasp, only to reappear, untouched, in a distant corner. A whispered secret, a desperate confession, might be repeated, chillingly accurately, by someone who couldn't possibly have heard it, their eyes wide with terror and confusion. They were the camp's unseen manipulators, its insidious puppet masters, pulling invisible strings, amplifying the suffering, orchestrating the despair. One night, a new prisoner, a young man named Samuel, arrived. He was defiant, his eyes still holding a spark of hope, a flicker of rebellion, a vibrant defiance that stood out starkly against the prevailing gloom. Elias saw the echoes gather around him, drawn to his vibrant, untainted spirit like moths to a flame, their forms shimmering with a renewed intensity. They whispered to him, unseen, unheard by others, weaving insidious doubts, planting seeds of despair, twisting his thoughts, eroding his will. Samuel's hope slowly withered, replaced by a profound, crushing hopelessness that settled over him like a shroud. Within a week, he was just another shuffling, hollow-eyed shell, his spark extinguished, his spirit broken, ready to join the silent ranks of the echoes. Elias understood then. The camp didn't just kill the body, it killed the soul. It was a spiritual charnel house, and the echoes were the instruments of that spiritual death, ensuring a fresh supply of tormented spirits to join their ranks, to swell their numbers, to perpetuate the cycle of despair. He realized he had to fight, not just for his physical life, which was fleeting, but for his very essence, for the integrity of his soul. He started to resist the despair, to cling to memories of sunlight, of laughter, of the scent of his books, of the warmth of his wife's hand in his. He would recite poetry in his mind, lines from Homer or Virgil, sing forgotten songs from his childhood, anything to create a flicker of light, a spark of life within himself that the echoes could not consume, a bastion against their encroaching darkness. The echoes hated it. Their whispers intensified, turning into a cacophony of dry, angry snarls, 1,000 discordant voices trying to drown out his thoughts, to shatter his resolve. They would press in on him, their cold presence suffocating, trying to crush his spirit, to force him to abandon hope. He would wake in the dead of night, feeling spectral hands on his throat, trying to choke the life out of him, not physically, but spiritually, trying to steal his breath, his will to live. One freezing morning, during roll call, as the biting wind whipped through the ranks of shivering prisoners, a guard singled out a frail, elderly man for punishment, his face contorted in a sneer. The guard's face was impassive, a mask of cold indifference, but Elias saw something else, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer around the guard, a subtle distortion in the air, a faint glow in his eyes. The echoes were influencing them, subtly guiding their cruelty, amplifying their malevolence, turning them into unwitting tools of their spiritual torment. The camp was a symbiotic horror, the living guards and the spectral echoes working in concert to break the prisoners, body and soul. Elias knew he couldn't escape the camp physically. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the armed guards, the sheer exhaustion, they were insurmountable barriers. But he could try to escape the echoes, to deny them his soul, to preserve his inner light. He began to share his memories, his stories, his fragments of hope with the few prisoners he trusted, those whose eyes still held a glimmer of something human. He would whisper tales of beauty, of love, of a world beyond the barbed wire, of art and music and freedom, trying to ignite a flicker of defiance in their own dying spirits, to remind them of what they were, what they had been. The echoes retaliated with renewed fury. The whispers became screams in his mind, 1,000 tormented voices trying to drown out his thoughts, to drive him mad. He would find himself inexplicably drawn to dangerous tasks, to places where the guards were most brutal, where the risk of death was highest. He knew they were trying to force him into a situation where his spirit would finally break, where he would succumb to despair and join them, another tortured soul in their eternal prison. One bitter evening, as the snow fell like ashes, coating the camp in a shroud of white, Elias was tasked with clearing a frozen ditch, the ice biting at his exposed skin. He was weak, shivering uncontrollably, his body screaming in protest with every movement. The echoes were all around him, their cold presence overwhelming, their whispers a deafening roar in his mind, a chorus of temptation and despair. Give up, Elias. Join us. There is no escape, only oblivion, only peace in the darkness. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, not physical, but an intense, crushing despair that threatened to consume him, to snuff out his last spark of life. He saw the faces of his loved ones, fading, blurring, as the echoes tried to erase them from his memory, to sever his last ties to life, to humanity. But then, a memory, sharp and vivid, cut through the haze of pain and despair. The scent of his wife's perfume, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the warmth of their embrace. A defiant spark ignited within him, a fierce, burning ember of hope, a refusal to yield. He would not give them that. He would not surrender his soul. He began to sing, a low, ragged murmur at first, barely audible above the wind, then growing stronger, a forgotten lullaby from his childhood, a melody of love and innocence. His voice was hoarse, broken, raw with emotion, but it was his voice, a sound of life, a defiant act of creation in a place of systematic destruction. The echoes recoiled, their whispers turned into pained shrieks, their forms flickering, dissolving like mist in the wind, unable to withstand the pure, unadulterated sound of life. The music, a vibrant pulse of life, a melody of human connection, was anathema to their spectral existence, a burning light against their shadow, a force they could not comprehend or endure. The guards, drawn by the strange, defiant sound, approached, their rifles raised. Elias continued to sing, his eyes fixed on the gray, oppressive sky, his voice a defiant beacon against the encroaching darkness. A guard raised his rifle, his face impassive, his finger tightening on the trigger. But as he looked at Elias, something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of confusion, a momentary hesitation, a brief crack in the cold mask. The echo's influence, weakened by Elias's defiance, was momentarily broken, their hold over the living momentarily severed. The shot rang out, sharp and final, echoing across the frozen landscape. Elias fell, the cold earth rising to meet him, a final, brutal embrace. As his vision blurred, he saw the gray sky, and for a fleeting moment, a patch of brilliant, impossible blue, a glimpse of the world beyond the wire. He felt the cold embrace of death, but it was not the cold of the echoes. It was the cold of release, of peace, of freedom. His body lay in the snow, another number, another statistic in the camp's grim ledger. But his spirit, unbroken, soared, a defiant spark against the eternal gray. The echoes shrieked in frustration, their whispers turning into a chorus of impotent rage, their spectral forms writhing in torment. They had tried to claim him, but he had denied them. He had escaped their grasp, his soul untainted by their despair, a victory won in the face of absolute horror. The camp continued its grim work. More trains arrived, more numbers were tattooed, more souls were slowly extinguished. The echoes still lingered, drawn to the fear, feeding on the despair. Their whispers a constant, chilling presence, an eternal torment. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the barbed wire, carrying the scent of ash and despair, the oldest prisoners, those who had seen too much, those who clung to the last vestiges of hope, would swear they heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible melody, a snippet of a lullaby carried on the wind, a sound that seemed to defy the very nature of the camp. It was a sound of defiance, a whisper of hope, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, even in a place designed to crush all spirit, some spirits could not be broken. And that even in a place designed to extinguish all life, some echoes fought back, not to torment, but to remind those who remained that true death was not of the body, but of the soul, and that, they knew, was a fate far more terrifying than the camp itself. The scent of rosin and sweat clung to the air in the hallowed halls of the Volkov Ballet Academy, a perpetual perfume of ambition and sacrifice. Alara, a wisp of a girl with a steel spine and eyes that held the fierce fire of 1,000 suns, lived for this scent. Every muscle in her lithe body was a testament to years of grueling discipline. Every ache a whispered promise of perfection. She was a rising star, a prodigy, but even in her talent, there was a shadow. The academy, renowned for its rigorous training and unparalleled artistry, was also notorious for its legends, tales of dancers who pushed too far, who vanished, or who simply broke. Her current obsession, and the source of a growing unease, was the upcoming performance of the Obsidian Swan, a ballet whispered about with a mixture of reverence and dread. It was a rarely performed masterpiece, a ballet of such technical difficulty and emotional intensity that it was said to consume its lead dancers. The role of the Black Swan, in particular, was cursed, demanding a surrender so absolute that some believed it was less a performance and more a possession. The director, Madame Volkov herself, a woman whose stern gaze could wither even the most confident dancer, had chosen Alara for the lead. It was an honor, a dream come true, yet a cold dread settled in Alara's stomach. The previous lead, a brilliant but fragile dancer named Anya, had suffered a catastrophic injury during rehearsals, a snapped Achilles tendon, a career-ending rupture that had left her screaming on the stage, her cries echoing through the empty theater. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered of the swan's jealousy. As rehearsals for The Obsidian Swan began, the atmosphere in the academy shifted. The usual competitive tension was replaced by a palpable, almost suffocating sense of dread. The music, a haunting, dissonant score by a forgotten composer, seemed to seep into the very stone of the building, echoing in the empty studios long after the pianists had left. Alara found herself practicing late into the night, driven by a relentless need to master the role, to embody the Black Swan's malevolent grace. It started subtly. The mirrors in the main studio, usually pristine, would sometimes show fleeting distortions in her reflection. A flicker of something gaunt and pale behind her, a pair of eyes that were not her own, wide with a silent, desperate agony. She'd spin, heart pounding, to find nothing but the empty studio, the cold, silent mirrors reflecting only her own exhausted form. The faint scent of something metallic, like old pennies or dried blood, would occasionally waft through the air, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Then came the sounds, faint whispers, like dry leaves skittering across the polished wooden floor, when no wind stirred. The distinct, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of point shoes on the floor above, long after the last dancer had departed. Sometimes, a low, guttural sigh, like someone struggling for breath, would echo from the wings of the empty theater. Alara attributed it to the old building settling, to her own fatigue, to the immense pressure of the role. But the incidents grew bolder. She would leave her point shoes meticulously placed by her bag, only to find them later in the center of the studio, their ribbons untied, splayed as if they had just been danced in. Her practice costume, left neatly folded, would sometimes be found crumpled in a corner, or even draped over a ballet bar, as if a spectral dancer had used it. The faint metallic scent grew stronger, more persistent. The whispers began to coalesce into fragmented, chilling phrases. She dances, she suffers, the swan demands. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the shadows clinging to the corners of the studio, from the depths of the empty theater. The air around her grew noticeably colder, even in the heated studios, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into her very marrow. Sleep became a battleground. Nightmares, vivid and terrifying, plagued her. She dreamt of the Black Swan not as a character she danced, but as a living entity. In these dreams, the swan was a gaunt, skeletal figure, its eyes glowing with an internal, malevolent light, its point shoes clicking a relentless rhythm on an endless, dark stage. It would dance around her, its movements a grotesque parody of ballet, its long, bony fingers reaching for her, its whispers a deafening roar in her mind. Give yourself. Surrender. Become the swan. She jolted awake one night, heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of old blood thick in her nostrils. Standing at the foot of her bed, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the window, was a shimmering, translucent figure. It was vaguely human-shaped, but distorted, elongated, its limbs impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It wore a tattered, dark tutu, and its feet were encased in what looked like ancient, blood-stained point shoes. It was Anya, or what was left of her. A silent scream tore through Alara's throat. The apparition raised a skeletal hand, its fingers beckoning, its mouth opening in a silent, agonizing gasp. Then, it recoiled, dissolving into the shadows of the room. Alara scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp it. When the room flooded with light, there was nothing. Only the lingering scent of decay and the profound, oppressive cold. She could no longer deny it. The legends were real. The Black Swan was not just a role. It was a curse, a hungry entity that consumed its dancers, binding their tormented souls to the academy, forcing them to dance forever, spectral shadows in the halls of their former glory. Anya was just one of its victims, a new addition to its grim collection. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Alara began researching the ballet's origins. The Academy's archives, usually locked away, held a hidden section, dusty and forgotten. She found fragmented accounts of the ballet's composer, a reclusive and supposedly mad genius named Viktor Volkov, the great-grandfather of the current director. His journals, written in a frantic, almost illegible hand, spoke of a pact with the shadows, of infusing life into art, of a sacrifice for true perfection. The entries grew more disturbing, detailing how the music itself became a conduit, a binding spell, drawing in the essence of the dancers, their pain, their ambition, their very souls, to give the Black Swan its chilling vitality. He wrote of the hunger of the swan, its insatiable desire for more, for life. The more she read, the more the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a terrifying picture. The ballet wasn't just difficult, it was a ritual. The Black Swan wasn't just a character. It was a parasitic entity, a construct of dark magic and tormented souls, feeding on the life force of its performers, growing stronger with each one it consumed. The injuries, the breakdowns, the disappearances, they were all part of the swan's insatiable appetite. The air in the academy grew thick, heavy with an oppressive presence. The whispers intensified, no longer just fragmented phrases, but a chorus of dry, rustling voices, growing louder, closer, echoing Viktor Volkov's frantic scrawl. Give yourself. Surrender. Become the swan. You are ours now. One afternoon, during a solo rehearsal on the main stage, the lights in the theater flickered, then died, plunging the vast space into near-total darkness. Only the emergency lights, casting long, dancing shadows, provided a meager illumination. Alara froze, her heart pounding. The whispers were all around her, a cacophony of tormented voices, pressing in, suffocating. Then she saw them, shimmering, translucent forms, dozens of them, drifting onto the stage from the wings, from the empty seats in the auditorium. They were the echoes, the spectral dancers, the previous victims of the Black Swan. They wore tattered tutus, their forms distorted, their limbs impossibly thin, their eyes glowing with a faint, internal light. They began to move, a silent, macabre ballet, their spectral point shoes clicking a chilling rhythm on the stage, a dance of eternal torment. At the center of them, taller, darker, more defined than the others, was the black swan itself. It was a terrifying figure, a skeletal ballerina, its head tilted, its empty eye sockets fixed on Alara. Its movements were fluid, graceful, yet utterly devoid of life, a chilling parody of perfection. It raised its long, bony arms, beckoning, its whispers a deafening roar in Alara's mind. "Come, little swan, join us, dance forever." Terror, cold and absolute, seized Alara. But beneath it, a flicker of defiance ignited. She was a dancer. She understood rhythm, movement, control. She would not be another victim, another echo. She remembered a line from Viktor Volkov's journal, a fleeting, almost desperate note. "The binding thread, woven with shadowed light, can be unraveled by pure, defiant sound." Pure, defiant sound. Not the haunting music of the ballet, but something else. Something alive. The black swan lunged, its skeletal fingers reaching for her. The echoes swirled around her, their cold presence suffocating, their whispers a chorus of temptation and despair. Alara dodged, her training kicking in, her movements a blur of desperate evasion. She saw the stage door, a sliver of hope. She scrambled towards it, the spectral dancers hot on her heels, their clicking point shoes a relentless pursuit. The black swan was faster, its movements impossibly swift. It was upon her, its cold, spectral hand closing around her ankle, pulling her down. She fell, scraping her knee on the polished floor. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, Alara grabbed a discarded music stand, pulling it over, creating a momentary barrier. As she scrambled to her feet, she fumbled for her phone, her trembling fingers barely able to unlock it. She opened a music app, selecting a track not classical, not ballet, but a vibrant, pulsating electronic beat, full of life and energy, a defiant rhythm against the deathly silence. She cranked the volume to maximum, the speakers blasting the defiant sound into the confined space of the theater. The effect was instantaneous. The echoes recoiled, their forms flickering violently, their whispers turning into a cacophony of pained shrieks, 1,000 tormented voices crying out in agony. The music, a vibrant pulse of life, a defiant beat of human creation, was anathema to their spectral existence, a burning light against their shadow, a force they could not comprehend or endure. The black swan shrieked, a sound like grinding bones, its form twisting and contorting, its hold momentarily weakening. Alara pressed her advantage, pushing the volume even higher, the music a shield against the encroaching darkness, a barrier against the whispers. She saw the faint glimmer of dawn on the horizon, a thin sliver of gray light breaking through the theater skylight, painting the stage with the promise of a new day. As the first direct rays of sunlight touched the stage, bathing the theater in a gentle golden glow, the black swan shrieked one last, agonizing time. Its skeletal form dissolved, fading into nothingness like mist in the morning sun. The echoes, deprived of their anchor, their malevolent conductor, flickered, wavered, and then vanished completely, their whispers dying into a profound, liberating silence. Alara stood panting, her body trembling, her mind reeling. The music still blared, a triumphant anthem of life. She had survived. She had broken the curse. She never danced again. The stage, once her sanctuary, was now a place of chilling memories. The scent of rosin and sweat now brought a wave of nausea. The sight of a ballet bar sent shivers down her spine. She left the academy, leaving behind the world of perfection and sacrifice, seeking solace in the mundane, in the comforting predictability of everyday life. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled outside her window, she would hear it a faint, almost imperceptible tap-tap-tap of point shoes on a distant, unseen floor, and a chilling, high-pitched giggle just at the edge of hearing, a sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of her memory. She knew the black swan was gone, its curse broken, but the memory of its hunger and the tormented echoes it had created would forever haunt the hallowed halls of the Volkov Ballet Academy. And sometimes, just sometimes, a new, ambitious dancer, driven by the same relentless pursuit of perfection, would find themselves drawn to the obsidian swan, unaware of the chilling price of its artistry, unaware that some performances, once begun, never truly end. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless, drumming curtain that blurred the lines between sky and swamp. Private Miller, his uniform a sodden second skin, cursed under his breath as another cold drop found its way down his collar. His boots squelched with every step, each movement a struggle against the sucking mud that threatened to swallow them whole. Around him, the other members of Bravo Company moved like specters, their faces grim, their rifles clutched tight. "Any signs, Sergeant?" Miller rasped, his voice hoarse from the damp and the constant strain. Sergeant Thorne, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of 100 campaigns, merely shook his head. "Nothing but the damn frogs, Miller. And the silence. The silence. That was the real horror. Not the silence of a battlefield after the guns had fallen quiet, but a deeper, more profound quiet. The swamp should have been alive with the chirps of insects, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant cries of birds. But here, in this particular stretch of the Blackwater Mire, there was only the ceaseless patter of rain and the chorus of the frogs. They were everywhere, not the small, harmless tree frogs or the plump, croaking bullfrogs of home. These were different. Larger, for one, some the size of a man's fist, others almost as big as his head. Their skin was a mottled, sickly green, slick with mucus, and their eyes were the worst. Luminous, golden orbs that seemed to glow in the perpetual twilight of the swamp. Unblinking, unervingly intelligent. They watched, from lily pads, from the gnarled roots of cypress trees, from beneath fallen logs. Always watching. The first incident had been a week ago. Private Jenkins, a nervous kid fresh out of basic, had gone to relieve himself behind a thicket of reeds. They'd heard his scream, a choked, gurgling sound that had sent a shiver down every man's spine. When they found him, he was sprawled face down in the shallow water, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth agape. And clinging to his face, a dozen of the large, green frogs, their bodies twitching, their long, sticky tongues flicking in and out of his open mouth. Thorne had shot them off, one by one, their bodies exploding in a spray of green ichor and bone. But the image of Jenkins's vacant stare, and the way the frogs had seemed to be feeding, had haunted their nightmares ever since. They tried to report it, but command had dismissed it as swamp fever, a hallucination brought on by the oppressive humidity and the psychological stress of the mission. "Keep moving, Bravo," the crackle on the radio had said. "Locate the objective."
No deviaciones.
The objective, a downed reconnaissance drone, deep within enemy territory. A simple retrieval mission, they'd been told. But the swamp had other plans. As they pushed deeper, the air grew thicker, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and acrid. The frog chorus intensified, a throbbing, guttural hum that vibrated in their bones, a sound that felt less like an animal call and more like a ritualistic chant. Specialist Davies, a quiet, stoic man who rarely showed fear, suddenly stumbled. He let out a choked cry, clutching his leg. "Something bit me. God, it burns." Miller dropped to his knees, shining his tactical light on Davies' shin. A large, dark red whelp was rapidly swelling, and a single, particularly enormous frog, its skin almost black, was hopping away into the murky water. "It's just a bite, Davies," Thorne said, trying to sound reassuring, but his voice lacked conviction. "We'll get you patched up." But Davies was already convulsing, his eyes rolling back in his head. Foam frothed at his lips. His skin began to take on a greenish tint, his veins bulging like thick cords beneath the surface. His fingers clawed at the mud, his body writhing in an unnatural dance. He's changing," Miller whispered, horrified. It was true. Davies' skin was growing slicker, his features distorting. His eyes, once human, were widening, turning a sickly yellow. A low, wet croak escaped his throat. Not his own voice, but something alien. Thorn, his face pale, raised his rifle. "I'm sorry, son." The shot echoed through the swamp, a stark punctuation mark to the amphibian chorus. Davies went still, a grotesque parody of a man, half human, half frog. The frogs around them, however, did not scatter. Instead, their calls grew louder, more insistent, as if in triumph. They buried Davies quickly, shallowly, the mud refusing to yield. The rain continued, washing away the evidence, but not the terror. Days bled into nights. The drone remained elusive. Their rations dwindled. And the frogs were always there. They no longer merely watched. They seemed to anticipate their movements, appearing suddenly on their path, blocking their way, their golden eyes fixed on them with an unnerving intensity. Private Rodriguez, a devout man who carried a worn Bible in his pack, began to talk to himself, muttering prayers, then curses. He swore the frogs were whispering to him, promising him release, promising him a new form. One morning, Miller awoke to find Rodriguez gone. His rifle lay discarded in the mud, and a trail of large, webbed footprints led away from their makeshift camp, deeper into the swamp. They followed, their hearts pounding. The footprints led them to a clearing, where the trees grew unnaturally twisted, their branches draped with thick, phosphorescent moss. In the center of the clearing was a pool of black, stagnant water, shimmering with an unholy light. And there, at the edge of the pool, was Rodriguez. But it wasn't Rodriguez. His body was bloated, his limbs elongated, his skin a mottled green. His mouth was a wide, lipless slit, and his eyes, once filled with human fear, now glowed with the same unsettling golden light as the other frogs. He was surrounded by dozens of them, all croaking, all watching. He turned his head, a slow, unnatural movement, and fixed his new amphibian gaze upon them. A low, wet chuckle, devoid of humanity, emanated from his throat. Thorn didn't hesitate this time. He opened fire, a burst from his automatic rifle tearing through the grotesque form that had once been their comrade. The frogs scattered, a green wave receding into the shadows. "We have to get out of here," Miller choked, his stomach churning. "This place is cursed." "We can't," Thorn said, his voice grim. "Orders. The drone. The drone." It had become a phantom, a reason to stay in this living nightmare. They found it eventually, nestled in a clearing choked with strange, bulbous fungi. It was intact, miraculously, its metallic shell gleaming dully in the perpetual gloom. But as they approached, the ground around it began to ripple. The fungi pulsed with a faint, internal light, and then they emerged. Not just the frogs, but something else. Larger, much larger. From beneath the earth, from the depths of the black water, they rose. Colossal amphibians, their bodies the size of small tanks, their skin a patchwork of scales and slick mucus, their eyes, enormous and golden, fixed on the soldiers with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. Their mouths, vast and gaping, revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. These were not mere animals. These were the masters of the mire, the architects of the horror. One of them, a monstrous creature with a crown of jagged bone protruding from its head, let out a deafening croak that shook the very ground. The smaller frogs, thousands upon thousands of them, surged forward, a living tide of green and gold. "Open fire!" Thorn roared, his voice barely audible above the rising din. They unleashed a volley of bullets, but the creatures were too numerous, too resilient. The rounds seemed to glance off their thick hides, or simply embed themselves without effect. The smaller frogs, however, were a different matter. They swarmed, leaping onto the soldiers, their sticky tongues lashing out, their sharp claws tearing at flesh. Miller felt one land on his face, its cold, wet body pressing against his cheek. He screamed, tearing it off, its tiny, sharp teeth leaving angry red welts. Another latched onto his arm, its grip surprisingly strong. He could feel its tongue, rough and abrasive, exploring his skin. He saw Private Chong, a quiet, studious man, overwhelmed by a dozen of the smaller frogs. They covered him, a living shroud, their bodies twitching, their tongues working. He thrashed, his screams muffled, then ceased. When the frogs finally dispersed, Chang was gone, his uniform lying in a crumpled heap, empty. "They're dissolving them," Thorn yelled, his face contorted in a mask of horror. "Their skin, it's acidic." The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. The mucus, the tongues, the rapid decomposition of Jenkins and Chang. These frogs weren't just biting. They were consuming, dissolving their victims, absorbing them into their grotesque forms. The colossal amphibians advanced, their massive bodies crushing the fungi, sending tremors through the ground. Their croaks were no longer just calls. They were a symphony of hunger, a promise of oblivion. Thorn, his face grim, emptied his magazine into the largest of the creatures, but it merely blinked its golden eyes, unfazed. He turned to Miller, his expression one of grim resignation. "This is it, son. Make it count." Miller, his hands shaking, raised his rifle. He fired, but his shots were futile. The swamp was closing in, the green tide of frogs washing over them. He felt a sharp, burning sensation on his leg, then his arm. The acidic mucus was already at work, dissolving his uniform, stinging his skin. He saw Thorn, surrounded, fighting valiantly, but ultimately overwhelmed. The last thing Miller saw before the world dissolved into a blinding green haze was Thorn's face, contorted in a final, defiant scream, as the monstrous amphibians closed in, their vast mouths opening, ready to consume. The rain continued to fall, washing over the Blackwater mire, cleansing it of the last vestiges of humanity. The drone lay undisturbed, a silent monument to a mission that had gone horribly wrong. And the frogs, the masters of the swamp, resumed their ancient, guttural chorus, a lullaby of consumption, a song of the mire. The golden eyes watched, unblinking, waiting for the next intrusion, the next meal. The swamp had claimed its own, and it would continue to do so forever.